Hello everyone, welcome to Frightening Tales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax and dive into tonight's case. Everything is bigger in Texas, and crime is no exception. From frontier lawlessness to modern mayhem, the state's history has piqued curiosity around the world, in some part due to its tales of wrongdoing and the often titillating media attention that inevitably follows. True crime may boast a current surge in popularity, but public interest in the subject is nothing new. As local stories make international headlines, however, one begins to wonder when reporting becomes storytelling and storytelling becomes sensationalism. What follows are 10 singular tales of murder, scandal, and tragedy set in the Lone Star State. All are crimes with victims deserving of respectful consideration. The selection of cases represents the range of the archive's film and video collection and how such materials capture aberrant behavior more so than a particular crime's importance. We seek not to sensationalize these events but rather use them to examine the compelling and often contentious intersections between true crime and media. Combining local television coverage with newsreels, government films, home movies, and more, True Crime Tales not only uncovers the facts of each crime but also highlights the processes of police investigation and the criminal justice system. Featuring multiple cases of past police misconduct, the exhibit also considers questions of law enforcement accountability and community relations. In every instance, True Crime Tales explores how Texans produce and consume crime stories. What cases capture our attention and how do crimes become legends? Story 1. Depression-era desperados. The story of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow began when the couple met in Dallas in 1930. By that time, Barrow boasted a lengthy rap sheet, spanning from petty theft to armed robbery. Just a few months after the couple's first encounter, authorities arrested Barrow for auto theft and sent him to Eastham Prison Farm in Houston County. There he committed his first murder, bludgeoning a fellow inmate who had habitually abused him. Paroled in February 1932, Barrow reunited with Parker and assembled an eclectic group of criminal associates. The so-called Barrow Gang then embarked on a 2-year crime spree, robbing small banks, stores, and gas stations, and killing any civilians or law enforcement officials that stood in their way. By 1934, authorities considered the outlaws responsible for as many as 13 deaths. The manhunt for Parker and Barrow came to an end in Bienville Parish, Louisiana, on May 23, 1934, when a posse of 4 Texas officers and 2 Louisiana officers ambushed and opened fire on the couple. Both died at the scene. Texas Ranger Frank Hamer began tracking the crime duo in February 1934. He caught up with the pair 3 months later. On the morning of May 23, Hamer and 5 other officers from Texas and Louisiana concealed themselves in the bushes along the highway near Saley's, Louisiana. When Parker and Barrow stopped to help the father of their associate, Henry Methvin, who was working in cooperation with authorities, the posse unleashed a hail of bullets. This grisly footage captures the aftermath of the shootout. Produced by the Dallas-based Jameson Film Company, this short film combines dramatic reenactments with actual footage to chronicle the infamous couple's rise and fall. Like much of the media coverage at the time, this film takes liberties with the details of their crimes. Among other inaccuracies, the narrator falsely identifies Parker as the shooter of Highway Patrolman H.D. Murphy. Nevertheless, the film also includes scenes of the aftermath of the shootout with police as well as the couple's funerals in Dallas. Barrow and Parker achieved national notoriety long before their demise. Photographs of the good-looking couple found in their Missouri hideout in 1933 were published by the press, which glamorized their life of crime. In death, however, the outlaws' lethal legacy became cultural legend. More than 20,000 people attended Parker's Dallas funeral. The sensational and romanticized story of Bonnie and Clyde spawned numerous retellings, including 2 Hollywood films. Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde, 1967, starring Faye Dunaway and Warren Beatty, filmed on location across north-central Texas. Bonnie and Clyde, 1967, filmed on location all over north-central Texas, with the region playing such a significant role in the film's production that Denton hosted its Southwest premiere. This silent home movie provides a behind-the-scenes glimpse of filming in Venus. Locals explore the 1930s set pieces while stars Dunaway and Beatty perform an early scene outside a storefront. Story 2. Why did John Leonard Orr become a firebug? On the night of October 10, 1984, as Game 2 of the World Series was about to begin, a raging fire broke out at a hardware store in South Pasadena, California. As the inferno spread, the roof caved in. Dozens of firefighters came from 10 cities and spent hours fighting the blaze, according to the Los Angeles Times. The incident claimed the lives of 4 victims, including a 2-year-old and his grandmother, and officials quickly determined the cause to be an electrical fire. But when the highly regarded arson investigator John Leonard Orr arrived at the scene, he disagreed with their analysis, insisting it was arson. Orr was, of course, correct because, as investigators later learned, Orr himself started the fire. And this act of arson wouldn't be his last. L.A. County Deputy District Attorney Michael Cabral, who ultimately tried Orr on 4 counts of murder, estimates that Orr started probably in excess of 2,000 fires by the time of his arrest in 1991, the L.A. Times reported. Orr's story from the Pasadena fire through his 1998 California trial took several unexpected turns. He became an arson investigator convicted of arson. While gathering evidence, police also discovered a book manuscript Orr had written detailing the crimes of a fictional firefighter, Aaron Stiles, who sets fires to local businesses, with clear similarities to Orr's own crimes. Orr's early life and career. Orr was born on April 26, 1949, in Los Angeles, California, one of 3 sons to parents who separated when Orr was 16 years old. On Orr's 18th birthday, he joined the U.S. Air Force, according to Fire Lover, a true story, a biography of Orr written by Joseph Wambaugh. After finishing basic training, Orr was assigned to jet mechanics school but transferred to firefighting school. He married his high school girlfriend, Jody, soon after. Orr was honorably discharged from the military at the age of 21. He applied to the Los Angeles Police Department but was rejected after failing the psychological test. Orr was admitted to the Los Angeles Fire Department, but his offer was later rescinded. Around the same time, he and his first wife divorced, after having 2 daughters together. In 1974, Orr landed a much lower-paying job as a firefighter at the Glendale Fire Department. Over time, he climbed the ladder to captain and arson investigator. Stream the Cold Case Files episode about Orr's case, Diary of a Serial Arsonist, in the A&E app. From arson investigator to accused of arson. As an investigator, Orr seemed to have a knack for identifying the causes of fires and the devices used to start them. He once bragged of catching more than 40 serial arsonists, the L.A. Times reported. Investigators once referred to Orr, his identity then unknown, as the pillow pyro for setting fires to pillows in linen stores. Others called him a firebug, a person who deliberately sets fires. He also set fires near conferences that he and other arson investigators attended across the state. According to the L.A. Times, Marvin Casey, an arson investigator from Bakersfield, California, took note of the suspicious pattern and cross-listed the names of attendees who attended the conferences where fires broke out. Orr's name made the list. In a 1987 fire incident, firefighters discovered an incendiary device made from a cigarette, matches and piece of yellow notebook paper, and on it, a fingerprint. That piece of evidence wouldn't be traced to Orr until spring 1991, when a task force of local police officers and federal agents used new fingerprinting technology. They said, "Tell John Orr to stop handling evidence," Mike Matissa, a task force case agent, told the L.A. Times in 2025. Obviously, everybody froze. Evidence in Orr's unpublished book. Orr was arrested in December 1991 for multiple fires. Among his belongings, investigators found a 104,000-word manuscript for an unpublished book Orr was writing. Titled Points of Origin, the book had uncanny, striking similarities to evidence in this trial, United States Attorney Patrick Hanley told the New York Times in 1992. In the book, the fictional Aaron Stiles is a firefighter turned arsonist who sets fire to a hardware store where 5 people die, including a young boy. For Aaron, fire is also a source of sexual arousal. It was disgusting to read his book, that was supposed to be fiction, and having in the back of my mind that he wrote it about himself, his daughter, Lori Orr Kovac, told A&E True Crime in a 2018 interview. Orr Kovac is the co-author of Burned, Pyromania, Murder, and A Daughter's Nightmare. Orr still claims the manuscript is fiction. But in a letter to a publisher, Orr once described the novel as a fact-based work that follows the pattern of an actual arsonist that has been setting serial fires in California over the past 8 years, according to the Associated Press. Guilty on arson and murder charges. A federal jury found Orr guilty in July 1992 on 3 of 5 arson charges and sentenced him to 30 years in federal prison. In 1993, he pleaded guilty to setting 3 additional fires. In 1998, Orr was tried at the state level not just on 21 counts of arson but also 4 counts of first-degree murder for each of the 4 people who died in the 1984 Pasadena fire. He was sentenced to life in prison. What drove Orr to commit arson? During his trial, his defense lawyers said Orr suffered from obsessive-compulsive personality disorder and a form of pyromania. Prosecutors argued he was motivated by a desire for power and secret knowledge, according to Fire Lover. Some experts blame a hero complex or impulse. The motive may also have been sexually driven, Orr Kovac told A&E True Crime. It was horrible to think that's exactly what he was doing, watching something burn and doing these horrible sexual things, she said. Where is John Leonard Orr today? Orr is completing a life sentence in Mule Creek State Prison in California. In February 2025, he denied the connection between Points of Origin and his own arson spree in a phone interview with the L.A. Times. He said the main character was created from 2 or 3 of the serial arsonists I apprehended. But a jury has already determined Orr's fate. Yet, for Orr Kovac, some wounds never heal. What's worse is someone I loved so much is capable of doing something so horrific. Story 3. Known as Shelby's sweetheart, Asha Jackia Degree went missing a quarter-century ago in a case that remains under investigation in her rural North Carolina hometown. 9-year-old Degree disappeared on February 14, Valentine's Day, 2000. She was last seen walking along a state highway in Shelby, North Carolina. Her parents reported her missing that same day. Based in Shelby, the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office is the primary agency investigating Degree's disappearance, along with outside assistance from the FBI and North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. Investigators on the 25-year anniversary of Degree's disappearance in February 2025 revealed they are close to solving the mystery and bringing closure to the girl's heartbroken parents. It will always be our desire to bring Asha home and to bring the individuals to justice, because it's going to happen, North Carolina Sheriff Alan Norman said in a social media post. We're closer than we've ever been with the modern technology that we have. How Asha Degree went missing. Degree's parents last saw her sleeping in her bed in the early morning hours of February 14, 2000. It is not clear how or why she left the home, but motorists reported seeing a black girl walking along a state highway about 4 a.m. that day. She was last seen being pulled into a car. Chief Deputy Derwin Briscoe, a longtime member of the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office, said he remembers when the Degree family reported their daughter missing. Once I arrived on the scene and I saw who the family was, it had a personal touch to me, Briscoe, a childhood friend of the girl's parents, said in a video posted on social media. This impacts the entire community of Shelby, impacts the entire county of Cleveland, because Asha was someone that everyone knows. On August 2, 2001, a year and a half after Degree went missing, investigators found her backpack buried in dirt off North Carolina State Highway 18 in Burke County, about 20 miles from her home. Other contents recovered with the backpack included an undershirt belonging to Degree. Later DNA testing on Degree's undershirt found evidence of a hair sample belonging to a close blood relative of two persons of interest, according to September 2024 search warrant documents published by WBTV. Was Asha Degree killed? Degree remains classified as missing, but investigators in their search warrants said she may have been killed. Authorities are investigating a specific family in southwestern North Carolina after a witness came forward with new information in September 2024. "I killed Asha Degree," a person of interest told a cooperating witness during a neighborhood house party. WSOC-TV, a local North Carolina news channel, reported. Who is responsible for Asha Degree's disappearance? Although investigators have identified persons of interest in connection with Degree's disappearance, no arrests have been made, and no charges have been filed to date. But a Cleveland County Superior Court judge has authorized search warrants allowing authorities to seize property belonging to persons of interest, including cell phones and a car. Degree's parents still have no answers explaining why their daughter vanished, which incidentally was on their wedding anniversary. "I believe she's still alive," Degree's mother Ikia Degree told supporters during a community prayer walk February 8, 2025, the News and Observer reported. "Until somebody can prove me wrong, I'm still going to believe that, because all I have is hope." New clues in the case. "We remain committed to finding Asha," a public affairs officer from the FBI's Charlotte Field office, which is about 40 miles west of Shelby, tells A&E True Crime. The FBI has shared several videos on social media detailing how authorities are close to solving the case. "The community saw in September 2024 some of our efforts," Tim Adams, a local detective on the case, said in a social media video shared by the FBI's Charlotte Field office. "We were able to acquire court-ordered search warrants, multiple search warrants, where we went out and started a phase of investigation to try to find those answers. The investigating agencies are offering a combined cash reward of up to $45,000 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the person or persons responsible for Degree's disappearance. Anyone with information can call the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office at 704-484-4822 or the Federal Bureau of Investigation at 1-800-CALL-FBI, 225-5324. Next story. Known as Shelby's sweetheart, Asha Jackia Degree went missing a quarter-century ago in a case that remains under investigation in her rural North Carolina hometown. 9-year-old Degree disappeared on February 14, Valentine's Day, 2000. She was last seen walking along a state highway in Shelby, North Carolina. Her parents reported her missing that same day. Based in Shelby, the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office is the primary agency investigating Degree's disappearance, along with outside assistance from the FBI and North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. Investigators on the 25-year anniversary of Degree's disappearance in February 2025 revealed they are close to solving the mystery and bringing closure to the girl's heartbroken parents. "It will always be our desire to bring Asha home and to bring the individuals to justice, because it's going to happen," North Carolina Sheriff Alan Norman said in a social media post. "We're closer than we've ever been with the modern technology that we have." How Asha Degree went missing. Degree's parents last saw her sleeping in her bed in the early morning hours of February 14, 2000. It is not clear how or why she left the home, but motorists reported seeing a black girl walking along a state highway about 4 a.m. that day. She was last seen being pulled into a car. Chief Deputy Derwin Briscoe, a longtime member of the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office, said he remembers when the Degree family reported their daughter missing. "Once I arrived on the scene and I saw who the family was, it had a personal touch to me," Briscoe, a childhood friend of the girl's parents, said in a video posted on social media. This impacts the entire community of Shelby, impacts the entire county of Cleveland, because Asha was someone that everyone knows. On August 2, 2001, a year and a half after Degree went missing, investigators found her backpack buried in dirt off North Carolina State Highway 18 in Burke County, about 20 miles from her home. Other contents recovered with the backpack included an undershirt belonging to Degree. Later DNA testing on Degree's undershirt found evidence of a hair sample belonging to a close blood relative of two persons of interest, according to September 2024 search warrant documents published by WBTV. Was Asha Degree killed? Degree remains classified as missing, but investigators in their search warrants said she may have been killed. Authorities are investigating a specific family in southwestern North Carolina after a witness came forward with new information in September 2024. "I killed Asha Degree," a person of interest told a cooperating witness during a neighborhood house party. WSOC-TV, a local North Carolina news channel, reported. Who is responsible for Asha Degree's disappearance? Although investigators have identified persons of interest in connection with Degree's disappearance, no arrests have been made, and no charges have been filed to date. But a Cleveland County Superior Court judge has authorized search warrants allowing authorities to seize property belonging to persons of interest, including cell phones and a car. Degree's parents still have no answers explaining why their daughter vanished, which incidentally was on their wedding anniversary. "I believe she's still alive," Degree's mother Ikia Degree told supporters during a community prayer walk February 8, 2025, the News and Observer reported. "Until somebody can prove me wrong, I'm still going to believe that, because all I have is hope." New clues in the case. "We remain committed to finding Asha," a public affairs officer from the FBI's Charlotte Field office, which is about 40 miles west of Shelby, tells A&E True Crime. The FBI has shared several videos on social media detailing how authorities are close to solving the case. "The community saw in September 2024 some of our efforts," Tim Adams, a local detective on the case, said in a social media video shared by the FBI's Charlotte Field office. "We were able to acquire court-ordered search warrants, multiple search warrants, where we went out and started a phase of investigation to try to find those answers. The investigating agencies are offering a combined cash reward of up to $45,000 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the person or persons responsible for Degree's disappearance. Anyone with information can call the Cleveland County Sheriff's Office at 704-484-4822 or the Federal Bureau of Investigation at 1-800-CALL-FBI, 225-5324. Next story. The Bluestone family had it all: a respected father who served as a police officer, a radiant mother named Jill, and 4 beautiful children tucked away in a quiet neighborhood in Gravesend, Kent. They seemed like the kind of family everyone admired, but if there's one thing we've learned from true crime, it's that what you see on the outside can be a complete lie, because hidden behind the walls of that tidy home was a terrifying truth, one that would only come to light when 7-year-old Jessica Bluestone ran to a neighbor screaming that her father was trying to hurt her. And trust me, this is the kind of case that will stick with you for days, gnawing at you, leaving you with one chilling thought: what kind of father could do something like this to his own family? To truly understand how things spiraled so dark, let's first dive into the life of the man at the center of it all, the patriarch Carl Bluest. Carl was 36 at the time of the tragic events, and let me tell you, he wasn't some rookie cop. He was an experienced, seasoned police officer with the Rural Support Tactical Team of the Kent Police Force in England. Born and raised in a small coastal town, Carl had what you could call a peaceful yet challenging childhood. His dad worked as a mechanic, and his mom was a primary school teacher. From a young age, Carl was known for his strong character and his sense of responsibility. He wasn't just a bystander in his community, he was involved regularly, volunteering for causes like supporting orphanages and taking part in local environmental cleanup campaigns. The kid was all about Action. As a young man, Carl became obsessed with stories of justice and those heroic police officers you see in movies and read about in books, so it was no surprise when he decided to pursue a career in public policing. After completing his undergraduate degree in criminology in London, Carl joined the Kent police force, eager to make his mark. Now, it didn't take long for Carl to prove himself. He quickly became known as an outstanding officer, especially in patrolling and emergency response. For the first 10 years of his career, Carl worked in the hustle and bustle of busy urban areas, but eventually he realized there was a need for a strong police presence in rural areas too, so Carl transitioned to the Rural Support Tactical Team, where he specialized in complex cases, things like cattle rustling, poaching, and protecting rural areas from organized crime. As you can guess, Carl had a natural gift for connecting with the people in the communities he served. He earned their trust and cooperation, which made him a very effective officer. He showed great leadership and made smart decisions, especially in stressful situations. One of his biggest cases involved leading his team to take down a group involved in poaching rare animals, helping bring more than 10 people to justice. For Carl, being a police officer wasn't just a job. It was his way of standing up for what he believed in and protecting what mattered most to him. And of course, at some point he must have thought, if I can protect an entire community, why not start building my own family? That thought slowly became a reality. In 1993, Carl's life took another significant turn when he met Jill at a social party in Kent. Jill, at 31, was a successful administrative officer at Baston Council. With her intelligence, independence, and solid career, Jill was the kind of woman who naturally attracted attention, but it was Carl, with his calm demeanor and engaging conversational style, who really caught her eye. Carl, for his part, was immediately impressed by Jill's sharpness and strong sense of independence. She was the kind of woman who seemed to have everything together in life. It didn't take long before they started dating, and through their regular meetings, evening walks by the sea, and weekend trips, their bond deepened. By 1994, just a year after they met, they decided to tie the knot when Jill became pregnant with their first child. The wedding was simple yet deeply meaningful. It was an intimate affair with only close family and friends in attendance. The joy in the air was contagious as Carl and Jill exchanged vows. The smiles on everyone's face is a clear reflection of the hopeful future they were stepping into. After their wedding, Carl stayed with the Kent police force and slowly moved up the ranks. He was respected by his team and admired by many. Jill, just as hardworking, kept growing in her role as an administrative officer at Basildon Council. Together they worked hand in hand to build a life filled with love, stability, and success. They were the kind of couple people looked up to, strong in their careers and deeply committed to their growing family. At first, life felt almost perfect. The couple welcomed 3 more children, and with each new addition their bond seemed to grow stronger. Their home was full of laughter, milestones, and memories. From the outside looking in, they were a picture of happiness, a loving mom and dad for beautiful children, and careers that kept getting better. Friends and neighbors would often say they were goals, but sometimes what you see on the outside doesn't reflect what's really going on behind closed doors. As time passed, tiny cracks began to show in what seemed like a flawless life. These signs were small at first, hardly noticeable, but by the year 2000, things had started to change in a serious way. Carl, who had always been known for his calm and confident presence in uniform, was becoming someone very different at home. To his co-workers and friends, Carl still appeared kind and put together, but to Jill and the kids he was becoming someone they barely recognized. At home his patience began to wear thin. He started controlling things that didn't seem like a big deal, like where Jill went, who she talked to, and how she spent her time. What started as small comments slowly turned into strict rules, and those rules turned into threats. It didn't stop there. His voice, once calm and soft, was now full of anger. He began yelling during arguments, screaming so loud that it scared the children and left Jill shaking. Then came the violence. One night while Jill was pregnant with their 4th child, they had an argument that got out of control. Carl exploded in anger and struck her hard, hitting her shoulder and chest. She was left bruised, shocked, and afraid. That was the moment everything changed. From then on, the violence became part of their daily life. The man who had once Protected communities was now the one they needed. Protection from. Carl's temper only grew worse. He would wave a knife in front of Jill, his hands trembling with rage, warning her not to test him when things didn't go his way. He would throw objects, sometimes even in the direction of the children, just to scare them into silence. If Jill ever tried to leave the house during an argument, Carl would lock the doors, trapping her inside. The happy home they had built slowly turned into a place of fear. Jill, once full of confidence and joy, became quiet and cautious, always on edge. The children too learned to tiptoe around their father, hoping not to set him off what once looked like a dream. Life from the outside had become a nightmare no one saw coming. By June of 2001, after years of walking on eggshells, Jill finally hit her breaking point. She had stayed strong for so long, but the pain, the fear and the control had taken too much from her. It had drained her spirit. She reached deep inside herself, found the courage that had been buried, and made a choice, a powerful, life-changing choice. She told Carl she wanted a divorce, but instead of listening, instead of understanding that he had gone too far, Carl completely lost control. His ego, already bruised by years of clinging to power through violence, couldn't take the idea of losing her. His rage exploded. He attacked Jill again, but this time it was worse, much worse. He wrapped his hands around her neck and began to choke her. Jill couldn't even fight back. She passed out right there in their home. It could have ended her life. Thankfully, a neighbor heard the commotion and stepped in just in time. If it weren't for that brave soul, Jill might not have made it out alive now. Some people might ask, why didn't Jill report him sooner? Why didn't she press charges or just leave before things got so bad? And those are fair questions. When we look at situations like this from the outside, it can be hard to understand why someone would stay, but once you hear the full story, you'll see that it's never that simple. And after you do, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments too. Your voice matters. The truth is, when you're married to someone who hurts you, it's not just a matter of packing up and walking away. It's about surviving every single day. Becomes a careful balancing act, trying not to say the wrong thing, trying not to trigger another outburst. You learn to live in fear, and that fear controls everything you do. Asking for a divorce nearly cost Jill her life, so imagine what she feared might happen if she called the police or filed for a restraining order. What if Carl came after her with more fury? What if the system didn't protect her? These weren't just what ifs, they were real possibilities that she had to think about every day. And let's not forget, Carl wasn't just hurting Jill, he was hurting their kids too. Every time he screamed, every time he broke something, every time he threatened their mom, they were watching. They were learning to be afraid. Jill knew that one wrong move could put all of them in even more danger. Escaping wasn't just brave, it took strength in every possible way, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and physically. However, on the 25th of August 2001, Jill finally sat down with Carl and explained her plans. She told him she was moving to Basildon with their children, intending to put the house up for sale and start over as expected. Carl accused her of having an affair, just like he had done countless times in the past. However, it was no secret that Carl himself had been unfaithful numerous times, including having an affair with a female colleague. Jill had even confronted this woman over the phone about it. Jill had also confided in her sister-in-law Caroline, revealing that Carl's infidelity had pushed her into an affair with one of her own colleagues. This was a secret Jill had been carrying for a while, but now the truth was out. A few days later, Jill grew increasingly worried about Carl's behavior. On the 27th of August, Jill called Caroline again, expressing her fear that Carl had lost control. She also suspected he was secretly recording her private conversations, both at home and in the car. The tension between them was reaching a boiling point, and on that same evening, Carl made an unusual purchase at a local store. He bought a long piece of rope. When the store assistant asked why he needed it, Carl claimed it was for moving heavy furniture, but Jill knew something was off. On the 28th of August, after finishing his work shift, Carl went to a local pub for a drink with colleagues. Later, he stopped at a store to pick up groceries. By the time he returned home, the neighborhood was quiet. He spoke briefly with a neighbor before heading inside. It was then that the nightmare began. After watching an episode of The Bill, a popular police drama, Carl exploded in a fit of violent rage. Neighbors reported hearing shouting and a loud argument coming from the Bluestone House. Then moments later, Jill's 6-year-old daughter Jessica appeared at a neighbor's door. Panic-stricken and crying, saying, "Daddy's banging my head on the wooden floor. My daddy is hitting my mommy. Please call the police, I don't want daddy to kill mommy." Jessica cried, her terrified voice ringing out in the still night air. Her words sent chills through the neighbors, who immediately called the police. By the time the police arrived at the Bluest home, they were met with a scene so horrific it would haunt them forever. Jill's body was found lifeless on the kitchen floor, brutally murdered with 13 hammer blows to the back of her head. Her 3-year-old son Henry was discovered at bottom of the stairs, badly injured with 10 hammer wounds to his head. The injuries on his hands showed that he had tried to defend himself against his father's attack. Baby Chandler, just 18 months old, was found in his crib suffering from 6 blows to his forehead. Despite being rushed to the hospital, Chandler's injuries were too severe and he tragically died. Jill's 7-year-old son Jack was discovered alive but severely injured. He was curled up in a fetal position on the bottom bunk of his bed. Jack was quickly brought to the hospital along with his younger sister Jessica, who had bravely run for help. When paramedics reached Jessica, she was in a state of shock, repeatedly saying, "I can't get mommy out of my mind." Her words filled with grief and terror. Both children were rushed to the hospital with Jack in critical condition. Meanwhile, neighbors had reported hearing strange noises coming from the garage. When police entered with flashlights, they found Carl hanging from a beam inside the garage. It was clear that Carl had taken his own life, a tragic end to a horrifying act of violence. Carl's death meant that he would never stand trial for the brutal murders of his wife and children, but an inquest was held to investigate the events leading up to that night. The inquest revealed disturbing details that raised questions about how the situation had been handled by the authorities. Jill had reported 4 separate incidents of domestic violence to the police, yet no action had been taken. In the first incident, Jill contacted the police after Carl had physically assaulted her during an argument. She had visible bruises on her arms and told officers that Carl had pinned her to the wall. She also mentioned that this wasn't the first time he had hurt her, but it was the first time she felt brave enough to make a formal report. However, instead of taking action, the officers noted it as a domestic disagreement and left the scene without arresting Carl or even issuing a warning. No follow-up was made. The second report came a few months later. This time, Carl had thrown a heavy household object. Some sources say it was a chair at Jill in front of one of their children. The child had been terrified and screaming, but again, when Jill called the police, the officers did not make an arrest. She told them she feared the violence would get worse, but the incident was again downplayed, though it was more serious than the first. Officers allegedly advised Jill to give it time or seek counseling. No protective measures were taken. The third and fourth incidents were the most serious. On both occasions, Jill had made formal complaints and even provided photographic evidence of her injuries, as well as statements from neighbors who had heard or witnessed Carl shouting, throwing things and threatening Jill. In one instance, a neighbor told officers that they had seen Carl dragging Jill by her hair into the house. The police actually acknowledged the seriousness of these cases and forwarded them to the Crown Prosecution Service, which is responsible for deciding whether charges should be brought in criminal cases. But even though 2 full case files were submitted to the CPS, no charges were filed. The reasoning: it was claimed that there was insufficient evidence, or that Jill might not be a reliable witness because she had once briefly returned to Carl after an incident. No one seemed to consider that victims of abuse often feel trapped or manipulated and may stay out of fear or financial dependence. Even more frustrating was the fact that despite having 4 reports on file and 2 investigations that reached the CPS, no restraining order was issued, no social worker was assigned, and no safety plan was put in place. The police failed to treat Jill's situation as a high-risk domestic violence case, even though it clearly was. She was never offered a referral to a women's shelter, and Carl was never required to attend anger management or counseling. Domestic violence advocacy groups were quick to condemn the police for failing to take the necessary actions to protect Jill and her children. The groups argued that if Carl had received counseling or proper intervention, this horrific event might have been avoided. They also highlighted that Jill and her children had been failed by the very system that was meant to protect them, the inquest. Concluded that Carl Blue's behavior had gone unchecked and the tragic events that unfolded could have been prevented. With the right support and intervention, time and time again we see stories like this where the signs were there but the system failed to act, but this time it feels even more tragic because Jill didn't just have to fight her abuser, she had to fight the very system that was supposed to protect her, and in the end, that system let her down. Story 2. I really don't want to go to sleep anymore. Okay, it makes me to where I'm too scared. I really don't want to go to sleep. Okay, why was this 10-year-old so scared of sleep? The answer lies in a night that started like any other, a night when Robin Dawn lay in bed safe in the home she shared with her family, a night when the dark was just a cue to sleep until it wasn't. At 10 years old, Robin Dawn woke up to something no child should ever have to experience. Back at the Children's Advocacy Center, Robin was asked, "Do you know why you're here today? Something terrible happened inside that farmhouse, something unthinkable." And as the sun rose over the Texas Panhandle that morning, the nightmare was far from over. The 10-year-old Robin Dawn lived a quiet life in a remote farmhouse with her mother Michelle Conrad, her stepfather Brian Conrad, and her older brother Zach. Dawn, her stepfather, was a farmer, and her mother, 6 months pregnant, was preparing for the family's newest addition. It was the kind of life where days passed slowly, where the only sounds at night came from the wind rolling across the open fields. But on this night something far more sinister shattered the silence. On the night of September 30th, 2005, Robin saw a nightmare, a dream where she heard gunshots so loud they penetrated through her ears. But when she woke up, the nightmare didn't end. The gunshots were real. The deafening cracks of gunfire tore through the house, and then came the screams, her mother's screams. Panic seized her as she jumped from her bed, crouching by the door, trying to make sense of the chaos. Then came the footsteps, heavy, unfamiliar, and closing in. The sound of boots pounding against the wooden floor sent terror through her body. She barely had time to react before she launched herself back into bed, pulling the covers over her and lying still, forcing herself to disappear into the darkness. Then came the shots once again, 2 rounds fired directly at her. One grazed her left leg, the other tore past her arm. She didn't move, she didn't make a sound. The footsteps turned away, moving toward her brother's room. The gunshots started again. This time there were no screams, only a faint, agonized moan before silence swallowed the house once more. However, the silence was far from peaceful. It told a story of misfortune that swallowed the happiness of a loving family for 2.5 hours. Robin lay frozen in place, her body rigid, her breath shallow, forcing herself to remain invisible. The stench of gunpowder and blood clung to the air. The house, once filled with warmth, had become a graveyard of both bodies and dreams. But she couldn't stay there forever. Summoning every ounce of courage, she forced herself to move. Stepping over the carnage, she made her way to the phone and dialed 911. Her fingers trembled as she pressed each button, her heart pounding against her ribs. She knew one thing: whatever horror had unfolded in that house, she was the only one left to tell the story. However, hope lingered as she called for help. The nightmare wasn't over yet. The call came in just before dawn. It was a child's weak voice, small and trembling, cutting through the static of the 911 dispatch. The little girl wanted help, for somebody to come to the house and somehow make this nightmare end. The operator tried to calm her down, repeating assurances that help was on the way, but out in the middle of nowhere time stretched unbearably long. Robin Dawn stood alone in the darkness. The walls around her, the only home she had ever known, were now painted with bloodstains of her only loved ones. Texas State Trooper Chad Brooks heard the call. He pressed his foot to the gas pedal, but no matter how fast he drove, it wasn't fast enough. "I heard my mama scream," Robin sobbed into the phone, the desperation in her voice clawed at his chest. It was a child's life that depended on him. He had to move fast, somewhere beyond the static of the radio. Aaron Moriarty, a journalist from 48 Hours, was already asking the question that would haunt this case: why this family, why this house? Whoever had pulled the trigger hadn't just executed an entire household, they had left behind something they never intended to witness. 15 shots had torn through the farmhouse that night, and yet Robin Dawn had survived. The little girl gave directions with a clarity that she had just acquired. The incident had suddenly made her so much more responsible. It's on Highway 70, about 13.3 miles out from the bowling alley. She told the dispatcher that she had a purple shirt and purple pants on, making sure they identify her. As soon as they reached the scene, it was as if listing these details gave her a grip on reality, something to anchor her in her world that had just collapsed. Trooper Brooks' headlights finally cut through the darkness as his car rolled onto the gravel driveway. A small figure appeared, Robin clutching the phone like a lifeline. She didn't wait, she ran straight to him. He caught her in his arms, and for a moment she was just a terrified little girl. She spoke in frantic, desperate detail, telling him everything she had seen, everything she had heard. It was surreal how articulate she was, how she relayed the horror with such chilling precision. He told her it's going to be okay. But he knew better. Nothing about this was okay. He couldn't take her inside, not back into that house, not after what had happened. So he placed her in the patrol car and locked it, shielding her from the unfolding nightmare. Officers moved in with their guns drawn. The house had to be cleared and checked for survivors, if there were any left. The eerie quiet of the crime scene made every step feel heavier. Inside, the horrific truth awaited them. Sheriff Gary Henderson stood at the threshold, taking in the scene. There was no sign of struggle, no warning. It was as if life had been going on as normal. A coffee pot set to brew in the morning, a home preparing for the arrival of a new baby. It was until someone decided to snatch the piece of normality away. The east door had been kicked in. The shooter hadn't hesitated. Brian Conrad had been shot 3 times. Michelle 6. Even the family dog Molly hadn't been spared. 2 bullets to silence her barking. Robin sat in the patrol car, her eyes locked on the front door. She didn't know what they were seeing inside. She only knew what she was hoping for. She told herself her family would come out any second now, that they would be okay just like she was. But no one walked out, and in the haunting silence of that Texas dawn, Robin Dawn realized she was truly left alone. Had the bullet pierced through her body, Robin Dawn would not have lived to tell her story, but she had lived, and now the weight of that survival pressed against her like an unbearable force. Zach had not been so lucky. He had been shot 3 times in his sleep. He never woke up. Robin couldn't bring herself to ask the question that was clawing at her insides. Who else is alive? Chad Brooks, watching her, knew there was nothing he could do to undo what had happened, but he could do something, however small, to pull her back from the brink of losing it. When asked if there was anything she needed, her answer was heartbreakingly simple. She just wanted to feed her animals. And so, in the midst of the unimaginable horror they did, he followed her to the barn, helping her toss hay to the goats. For a moment Robin was just a little girl again, laughing at how much feed he tried to give them. The switch flipped. She spoke about how she and her brother Zach would play a game of feeding their animals, how it turned into a competition. Sometimes life almost felt normal again, but as soon as they stepped away from the barn, the illusion shattered. The nightmare crept back in. Robin clung to his arm, shaking, eyes wide with the truth. She had finally gathered the courage to say aloud she already knew the answer, but the weight of it pressed down on her. As she hesitantly voiced the question, was her mother and Brian coming back? No one wanted to say it, but she had to hear it. No, they weren't coming out. She was the only one who had walked out of that house alive. She tried to hold on to something, anything, to keep the pain at bay, and there was one thing, one small sense of ease. Zach never woke up. He never knew, he never felt it, and for that Robin was grateful. 12 hours after the massacre, Robin found herself in a small room at the Bridget Children's Advocacy Center. The walls closed in around her. A camera stared down from the corner with a microphone near her face to record the horrors that she had faced. She sat across from an advocate, answering the questions she had already answered too many times. She admitted that she didn't want to close her eyes, because that was when the terror crept back in. Robin repeated what she had told the 911 operator. The gunshots, the screaming, the scary footsteps, and the silence that followed. The advocate pressed gently, asking if she had heard anyone speak on that fateful night. Robin shook her head, because nobody talked. It was just a matter of minutes that someone walked in through the doors and took away all the lives in her home. She described what she had seen, or what she thought she had seen: a flash from the gun, a white face in the dark. Investigators listened Carefully knowing every detail could be crucial when asked how many shots had been fired, Robin responded without hesitation 15, and when they processed the crime scene, that's exactly what they found. 15 casings, 15 shots fired, a number burned into a 10-year-old girl's memory. At 3:00 in the morning she reached her limit, then Robin could no longer bear to talk about it. The interview ended, but for law enforcement it was the beginning of a mission. They had no suspects, no motive, no explanation, and most concerning of all, no guarantee that whoever had done this wasn't planning to do it again. Robin was placed under protection. The authorities weren't taking any chances. She was moved to a secure location with her biological father, stepmother, and stepsister. Surveillance cameras surrounded the perimeter. She wasn't allowed to leave for her own safety. Except for the funeral, the community poured into the church, grief-stricken and also scared for their safety. The Conrads had been the kind of family people looked up to, humble, hard-working, unpoetic. Their deaths shattered the peace that the town once held. Robin sat in the pew, her eyes moving from casket to casket, first one, then another, then the third, again and again. What happened was not fair at all. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Meanwhile, Texas Rangers had set up surveillance, scanning the crowd for anything suspicious, but nothing stood out. Doors that were once left unlocked were now bolted shut. Rifles were moved from storage closets to bedside tables. Parents tucked their children in at night with one hand on the light switch and the other on a loaded gun. All had their guards up. Somewhere out there a killer was still walking free. Investigators worked tirelessly, going through the evidence again and again. Shell casings, blood spatter, tire tracks, footprints that didn't belong to anyone in the house, but there was no DNA, no fingerprints, and no reason this wasn't a robbery. Nothing had been stolen, so what was it? One theory emerged: a possible drug hit, maybe a violent mistake, the wrong house. But with every lead came a dead end, and the only question that mattered, the one that haunted every sleepless night, remained unanswered. Who did this? Meanwhile, in the state of Missouri, detectives were piecing together the McColl murders. The bullets left behind were an unusual size, the kind that wasn't commonly sold in stores. A deputy recalled a recent burglary report of a man named Scott King who had reported that his son Levi had broken into his home, stolen weapons, and disappeared. The ammunition matched. The hunt was on. The Missouri sun had barely crept over the horizon when Matthew McColl's phone received a call. A relative's voice cracked through the line. He'd been trying to reach Matthew's mother, Dawn McColl, but there was no answer. A flicker of unease passed through Matthew, but he brushed it aside. It wasn't unusual for his mother to miss a call or two. By midday he grew more concerned. He left work as his hands gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly as he drove toward his family home. When he arrived, his stomach lurched. A relative stood outside, pale and trembling. The words barely made it past his lips. They were dead. He delivered the news with a heavy finality. Matthew barely heard the rest. His mother and grandfather, Orly McColl, had been murdered. Detectives arrived, methodically combing the crime scene. Shell casings littered the floor, their metallic sheen catching the light. As we discussed before, the bullets were an unusual size. They were not the kind you would pick at a local sporting goods store. Sheriff Michael Hall recalled a recent burglary report. A neighbor, Scott King, had reported that his son Levi had broken into his gun safe and stolen several firearms. The ammo matched Levi King, a name already known to law enforcement, a ghost that slithered through the cracks of the system. He torched a neighbor's house years earlier, spent a brief period in prison, then vanished from a halfway house, and now the blood of the mules soaked into the floors of their home. Authorities wasted no time. A warrant was issued, and within hours a nationwide alert went out for the McColl's stolen Dodge Dakota. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, a Border Patrol officer in El Paso, Texas, flagged a suspicious vehicle, a routine stop. But when the officer glanced at the man behind the wheel, something felt off. The truck's plates came back stolen. The driver's name was Levi King. They found guns in the truck. King remained eerily calm as investigators pressed him for answers, his demeanor unsettling in its emptiness. Then, just 15 minutes into the interrogation, he confessed. He recounted the first shot, how his target spun and collapsed. When questioned about the woman, his composure wavered for the briefest moment before he admitted to murdering her out of fear. With that, detectives had enough to tie him to the McColl murders. But King wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his expression unreadable, as if weighing whether to reveal something even darker. Theirs. 4 more in Texas. The words hung in the air. Detective Don Ruby's breath stopped for a second. Was King taunting them, or had his killing spree stretched even further? A gut-wrenching phone call confirmed their worst fears. A family in the Texas Panhandle had been slaughtered days earlier. It was the Don family. Levi King's rampage had spanned 2 states and left 6 people dead. He had moved like a phantom through the night, executing strangers without hesitation. For what a thrilling experience. Missouri took first claim to justice. King pleaded guilty and received 2 consecutive life sentences, but Texas wasn't as forgiving. The jury saw a monster, a man who killed because he could, because it exhilarated him. The courtroom was suffocating in its silence. Levi King sat motionless, his fate hanging in the balance. The man responsible for a senseless, merciless rampage that left multiple lives in ruin was about to learn his destiny. Gary Henderson, a resident of the devastated town, voiced the question that would forever haunt those left behind. Why this family? Why this day? Why this town? But there were no answers, only the chilling realization that sometimes horror had no reason, it simply arrived. Uninvited, unstoppable. Lynn Switzer, the former district attorney of Gray County, had no illusions about the kind of monster sitting in the defendant's chair. There truly are people out there who are just plain evil. Levi King is one of those people, she declared, her voice steady in front of the jury. 12 people held the power to decide his fate, and she was asking them for the ultimate sentence, which was death. But the weight of justice is never easy to bear. Defense attorney Jor Wilson understood that the sheer brutality of the crime could not be overlooked. The only hope was to convince the jury that permanent imprisonment was punishment enough, that ensuring he would never walk free again, never having the chance to hurt another soul, was justice in its own right. For Switzer, this case had consumed her, creeping into her dreams, seeping into her waking thoughts. Yet despite her best efforts, the burden of uncertainty lingered, because in the pursuit of justice there were no guarantees. The jury deliberated for nearly 8 excruciating hours, and when they returned, their verdict sent a shockwave through the courtroom. 1 juror refused to vote for the death penalty. 1 single holdout standing firm against the others sealed Levi King's fate. The sentence would be life without parole. Robin Don, the lone survivor of King's killing spree, sat frozen as the decision was read. She turned to Switzer, saw the shadow of devastation flicker across her face. It almost looked like she had failed us, Robin later recalled, but deep down, Robin knew the truth. Switzer had fought with everything she had. She had fought for her family, and for that no words of gratitude would ever be enough. Levi King would be extradited back to Missouri to serve his sentence, and Robin was more than fine with that. Texas is my state. I don't want you back in my state. You've already done your damage here. But even with King behind bars, Robin's battle was far from over. Pampa was more than just home. It was now a haunting ground. Every street and corner a painful reminder of what had been stolen from her. Leaving felt like surrender, like she had admitted defeat, yet staying meant facing the memories of that night over and over again. No matter where she went, the fear clung to her, inescapable and all too real. Those closest to her saw the wounds that couldn't be bandaged, the scars that remained unseen. Denise Mackey, her former coach and confidant, had witnessed the quiet torment Robin carried, the nightmares, the echoes of her mother's screams, the relentless grip of fear. None of it ever truly faded. Late at night, Robin's messages would come. She heard things, she was scared, and no matter how composed she seemed on the surface, the darkness still lived inside her. Superstition became her shield against the darkness. That night I had on socks, long sleeves and long pants. I will never sleep in long sleeves, long pants or socks again. I won't sleep with my door open. I feel like there's a figure standing in my doorway. Every time Robin walked into an empty house, she checked every room, every closet, making sure no one was there, even though the real nightmare had already passed. Some things, though, could never be shut away. Birthdays were the hardest, painful reminders of what she had lost. Even her own didn't feel right without them. Robin wanted her mom, her family, her life back. She had tried therapy, but it didn't help. If she needed to talk, she turned to her family or the officers who had been there. She thinks a stranger cannot understand. She didn't want pity. She didn't want to be seen as different. Robin just wanted to feel normal, but Normal would always be out of reach. Levi King had walked into her life like a nightmare and took away everything she ever loved. No verdict, no prison sentence could ever undo what he had taken. The painful memories were hers to bear alone. Still, there were people who refused to let her walk this path without support. Those who truly understood her pain stood by her, determined to help her find a way forward, even if that road was still shrouded in darkness. And Robin is forever grateful for that story. 3. Los Angeles was the city of dreams, but for some it was a nightmare they never woke up from. In the forgotten corners of South Central, black women vanished without a trace, only to be found dumped in alleyways, discarded like trash. The news barely made a headline. The police hesitated, and the killer was patient, calculated, moving unnoticed in plain sight. Then the killing stopped just like that. For over a decade the streets grew quiet again. No more bodies, no more headlines. It was as if the predator had simply disappeared. But monsters don't just stop, do they? Because years later, when everyone had stopped looking, he came back. The bodies kept turning up, strangled, stabbed, discarded like yesterday's trash. In South Los Angeles, the police knew something was wrong, that someone was out there hunting women, but for years they looked the other way as headlines obsessed over the wealthy victims of Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker, who had California for almost a year. The women of South Central were forgotten. No citywide panic, no task force mobilized overnight. These women were poor black sex workers or drug users. Society had already decided their fate, even as protests erupted outside LAPD headquarters demanding action. The killings continued. By 1986, the case had spiraled into confusion. Too many victims, too many killers. The so-called Southside Slayer Task Force began to shrink, and eventually the investigations faded into silence. The city moved on. For years the murders in South Los Angeles were blamed on a faceless predator the city barely acknowledged, but as investigators struggled to make sense of the bodies piling up, they began to realize the unthinkable. This wasn't the work of one man, it was worse. Too many victims, too many patterns. The so-called Southside Slayer was a myth, an easy label for a problem no one wanted to solve, but the truth was there were multiple killers, each lurking in the same hunting grounds, preying on the same forgotten women. Some were caught, others faded into the background, their crimes lost in a sea of indifference, and one of them was hiding in plain sight. He was a former city worker, a husband, a father. He shared beers with neighbors, cracked jokes at backyard barbecues, and even helped fix cars on his block. To those who knew him, he was just Lonnie, but behind closed doors he was an entirely different person, a monster to say the least. Lonnie Franklin Jr. blended in as a father, a husband, a neighbor, someone you'd pass on the street and say hello to without even a thought of them being harmful to you. But beneath the facade was a man who hid his monstrosity behind the mask of a normal person. And you know what men, driven by an uncontrollable need for dominance, do? They prey on those who are defenseless, the ones who are the vulnerable populations of society. His darkness wasn't new, it had been there for decades. In 1974, while stationed in Stuttgart, West Germany, Franklin and two fellow servicemen tricked a 17-year-old girl into their car. She thought she was helping them. Instead, they took her to a remote location and subjected her to an ordeal she would never forget. They essayed her for several hours. However, Franklin made a mistake. The girl, thinking quickly, pretended to be interested in him, asking for his phone number. Franklin, arrogant and overconfident, gave it to her. That single misstep led to his arrest. By 1975, he was dishonorably discharged from the U.S. Army after serving time for the crime, but back in South Central Los Angeles he picked up where he left off. More arrests followed. Theft, assault, battery. He spent time behind bars, but never long enough. Every time he walked free, blending back into the world like nothing had happened. And outside of a jail cell, Lonnie Franklin Jr. had something even more dangerous than freedom. He had opportunity. By the 1980s, Los Angeles was deep in crime, addiction, and neglect of its citizens. Entire communities were suffering, and many women, especially those already struggling with poverty or substance use, were left vulnerable. Some disappeared, some were later found discarded in alleys and abandoned lots, but many were simply never seen again. Even then, authorities took little notice. There were no urgent warnings, no relentless investigations to them. These were just unfortunate statistics in a City already overwhelmed with violence, but Franklin noticed, and in the shadows of a city in chaos he took full advantage. For years he continued being the monster that he was, living a normal life by day and submitting to his darkest urges by night. He was a husband, a father, a mechanic, a friendly face on the block. No one suspected a thing, but eventually the world would come to know the real Lonnie Franklin Jr., and when they did, they would be horrified by the mid-1980s. Fear had settled over South Central Los Angeles like a thick suffocating fog. Women, black women, marginalized women no one seemed to care about were disappearing. Their bodies later turned up in dumpsters, alleys and vacant lots. Their lives erased without so much as a headline. Whispers spread through the streets there was a killer among them. The police had a name: the South Side Slayer, a faceless predator believed to be responsible for at least 13 murders. Between 2 years 1983 and 1985 the victims were women who had fallen through society's cracks, many battling addiction, many forced into sex work just to survive. The newspapers called the crimes the Strawberry Murders, after the slang term for women who exchanged sex for drugs. But in the halls of the LAPD there was no urgency, no citywide warnings, no dedicated task force until September 1985. That's when the LAPD finally held a press conference acknowledging what the community had already known for years. Someone was hunting women in South Central. They pleaded for tips, they promised to investigate, but for many it was too little, too late, and no one was angrier than Margaret Prescott. She and other activists stood outside police headquarters week after week demanding action. They called out the department's failure to warn the community sooner. They pointed out the unbelievably unfair difference between this case and the one that was all over the news. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. That investigation had everything: press briefings, endless resources, manhunts. Ramirez terrorized wealthy white neighborhoods and the police moved heaven and earth to track him down. But here in South Central the victims weren't rich, they weren't white, and according to what Prescott claimed, and rightfully so, about the authorities, that meant they didn't matter. By January 1986 the body count had climbed to 15. Pressure on the LAPD grew. More detectives were assigned to the case. The department, now working with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, also known as LD, formed what they called the South Side Slayer Task Force. It sounded promising, it sounded serious, but still there were no arrests, no real progress. So Prescott and her group took matters into their own hands. They formalized their efforts under a new name, the Black Coalition, fighting back serial murders. In March 1986 they forced the Los Angeles City Council to raise the reward for information, doubling it from $10,000 to $25,000. They were relentless. They weren't going to let these women be forgotten. But then something changed. The evidence wasn't lining up, the patterns, the methods. They weren't the work of just one person. The police had spent years chasing a single serial killer. Now they realized the truth was far worse. There wasn't just one predator in South Central, there were several, for maybe more. The LAPD suddenly had a bigger problem. Suddenly there was an overlapping network of serial killers, all operating in the same hunting grounds, taking advantage of the same vulnerable population. By the end of 1986, the South Side Slayer Task Force started to fall apart. The city was spending millions on an investigation with no clear answers, and by the next year the task force was downsized. The flow of clues had dried up, leads were going nowhere. Lieutenant John Zorn, one of the task force commanders, admitted it: the flow of clues is almost non-existent at this point. Translation: the police were giving up, the killers were still out there, and the worst one of all, Lonnie Franklin Jr. He was watching, he was waiting, and the monstrosity was just getting started. For years the murders in South Central had faded into the background, cold cases, forgotten victims, no answers. Even when the LA streets still screamed with violence, the silence of the law enforcement was deafening. But in May 2007, several years later, a breakthrough shattered the silence. A 25-year-old woman, Jane Anisha Peters, was found murdered, and when investigators ran the DNA evidence they made a shocking discovery. Her killer's genetic profile matched at least 11 other unsolved murders dating back to 1985. The South Side Slayer may have been many people, but this was one man that Same year the LAPD formed a secret task force that would be called the 800 Task Force. 6 detectives in the robbery homicide unit worked in silence. They weren't just investigating a serial killer, they were investigating a ghost. Someone who was unseen. Yet his mischief was haunting the people of LA because for over 2 decades this predator had gone undetected. He had stopped killing, or so they thought. The killer had vanished without a trace, only to reappear 22 years later. Then after just 4 months the secret was out. Investigative journalist Christine Polisk from LA Weekly blew the case wide open. She exposed the task force's existence, the DNA connection between the old murders and the new one, and most damning of all, the silence. The city's leaders, Mayor Antonio Verrigosa and Police Chief William Bratton, had said nothing. No press release, no warning to the public, no acknowledgement that a serial killer had been stalking their streets for over 2 decades. And for some families, the LA Weekly article was the first time they heard the truth. Their daughters hadn't just disappeared. They had been murdered in cold blood years ago. By September 2008, pressure was mounting. Los Angeles officials finally stepped forward, offering a $500,000 reward for information on the killer, but the public still knew little. The case was filled with mystery. Then on November 1, 2008, the case was featured on America's Most Wanted. More eyes were on the case now, more pressure, more questions. Finally, in February 2009, Chief Bratton held a press conference. He gave the killer a name, the Grim Sleeper, a nickname chosen by LA Weekly. Why? Because this murderer had done something that most serial killers don't. He had stopped, or at least it seemed that way, from a span of 1988 to 2002. There were no known murders, no bodies linked to his DNA, no clues. He had vanished, and then in 2002 he struck again. But that wasn't all. Bratton also released a 911 call from the 1980s. A witness had called the police claiming to have seen a man dumping a body. He gave them a detailed description, even the license plate number of the van involved, a van connected to the now closed Cosmopolitan Church. The evidence had been there for decades, and yet the Grim Sleeper had remained free. Then in March 2009, Polisk landed an interview with the only known survivor. Her name was Initra Washington. She described him: a black man in his early 30s, neat, tidy, kind of geeky. He wore a black polo shirt tucked into khaki trousers. He didn't look like a monster, but she had seen his face. She had been inside his car, and she had lived to tell the tale. Now, after decades of silence, the LAPD was closing in. The Grim Sleeper's past was finally catching up to him, and this time he wouldn't disappear. The scariest part was that the police already had his name, they just didn't know it. Back in 2003, Franklin had been convicted of a felony and sentenced to 3 years of supervised probation, a perfect opportunity to collect his DNA. But it never happened. A year later, California passed Proposition 69, a law requiring DNA samples from all felons and those arrested for certain charges. A massive expansion of the state's database. Thousands of samples were collected, thousands, but Franklin's wasn't one of them. Between November 2004 and August 2005, probation officers failed to collect DNA samples from those on unsupervised probation. They were stretched thin, not enough resources, not enough manpower, and in that tiny loophole the Grim Sleeper stayed hidden. By 2010, the LAPD had DNA from multiple crime scenes. They knew their killer's genetic fingerprint, but when they ran it through the system there was no match. But then they tried something different, familiar DNA analysis. Instead of searching for a perfect match, they looked for relatives, someone in the database who shared enough genetic markers to be closely related to the killer, and that's when they found Christopher Franklin. Lonnie Franklin's son Christopher had been convicted of a felony weapons charge in 2008. He was too young to be the murderer, but the DNA was close enough to lead detectives straight to his father. Now they needed proof. An undercover officer was sent to a restaurant where Franklin was eating. His job was to get the killer's DNA. He posed as a waiter, sneakily collecting everything Franklin touched: dishes, silverware, a pizza crust. Back at the lab, they ran the tests, and this time there was no doubt it was him. Lonnie Franklin was the murderer. On July 7, 2010, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was arrested. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office charged him with 10 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder and a special circumstance allegation for multiple homicides. But the nightmare wasn't over, because when detectives searched his home they found something far worse than they ever expected. Inside Franklin's house, police found 180 photos of women. Some smiling, some looking scared, some unconscious, and that was just the beginning. In total there were over 1,000 photographs and several hundred hours of video. Women of all ages, teenagers, middle-aged, even older, most of them black, many of them undressed, posed vulnerable. Some of them were never seen again. The LAPD didn't know if they were victims or survivors, so Chief Charlie Beck made a horrifying statement: "We don't even know if they are victims, but we do know this." Lonnie Franklin's reign of terror spanned over 2 decades with almost a dozen confirmed murder victims. "We need to investigate further." The police released the images to the public, desperate to identify the women before it was too late. And then in November 2011, another horrifying revelation. Detectives reviewed hundreds of old case files and made a grim discovery. They believed Franklin was responsible for at least 6 more murders. 2 women had gone missing in 2005. Their bodies were never found. 2 more had been discovered in the 80s, and 2 others had been killed in that mysterious 14-year gap between 1988 and 2002, when everyone thought the grim sleeper went dormant. But now there was no doubt he never stopped. He had just learned how to hide better. After years of delays, the trial of Lonnie Franklin Jr. finally began on February 16, 2016. It had been a long road to justice, but now the victims' families would finally hear the truth laid out in court for nearly 3 months. The prosecution presented its case then on May 2. The closing arguments began 2 days later. The jury went into deliberation. It didn't take them long. By May 5, just a day and a half later, they had their verdict: guilty on all counts. A week later, at the sentencing hearing, prosecutors dropped another bombshell. They believed there were even more victims, 4 more women, namely Sharon Alicia Desmuckins Warren, Georgia May Thomas, and Relinia Morris, were now suspected to have been killed by Franklin. Sharon Alicia Desmuck was just 21 when she was found lifeless in South Park, Los Angeles on January 15, 1984. At the time, no one linked her murder to the grim sleeper. It wasn't until Franklin's arrest decades later that investigators saw the bizarre similarities: the way she was killed, the way her body was left behind. It all matched his signature. Then there was Elizabeth Warren. She was 28 when someone shot her on August 15. In the year 1988, she was still alive when first responders found her in an alley in Garcia Park, Los Angeles, but by the time she reached the hospital it was too late. Like Sharon, she wasn't considered a grim sleeper victim at first. That changed when investigators took a second look after Franklin was caught. Alicia Monique Alexander was just 18. She had her whole life ahead of her, but on September 11, 1988, that future was stolen. Her body was found dumped in an alley near 43rd Place and Western Avenue in Vermont Square, Los Angeles. Another young life brutally ended. Georgia May Thomas was different. Her murder came years later, during the so-called dormant years when the grim sleeper was supposedly inactive. On December 28 in the year 2000, she was shot and left for dead in South Park, Los Angeles, and just like the others, her case remained unsolved until Franklin's trial forced investigators to re-examine her death. And then there was Reliadelle Morris. She was 31 when she vanished on September 10, 2005, last seen near the 9000 block of Southwestern Avenue in Los Angeles. She was never found, but Franklin had something of hers: her Nevada driver's license, and even more disturbingly, 2 explicit photographs of her buried among the hundreds of other images in his garage. It was the final piece of evidence that tied her disappearance to his decades-long reign of terror. These women weren't just names on a list, they were daughters, sisters, and friends, and for far too long their cases were ignored. It took years, many years, to bring their killer to justice, but when the truth finally came out, there was no more hiding. Investigators had pieced together their connections to him only after his arrest, but their cases weren't part of the trial. Prosecutors feared adding them would drag things out even longer. On June 6, 2016, the jury made their final decision, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was sentenced to death 2 months later. On August 10, the judge made it official. By reading out the names of every victim he was convicted of murdering, and then, just when it seemed like justice had been served, Franklin met an unexpected end. On March 28, 2020, he was found dead in his cell. No signs of trauma, no official cause of death was released to the public. Just like that, the grim sleeper was gone, taking with him whatever secrets he hid in his chest as he waited for his death. It's hard to say exactly when Lonnie Franklin Jr. started killing. Prosecutors think his first victim was Sharon Alicia Desmuck in January 1984, but the first murder they could confirm was Deborah Jackson in August of 1985. She was shot and left lying on the streets like she never mattered, and then there was nothing for years. It was as if the killer vanished. No bodies, no reports, no trace. But did he really stop, or was he just getting better at hiding his crimes? That's the question that would haunt investigators for decades. But the truth was, he never really slept. They just hadn't found everyone yet. His last known victim was killed in 2007, and by then a terrifying pattern had emerged. Almost all of them were black women, many of them sex workers, easy targets, women that society already overlooked, and Franklin knew that, and he took advantage of it. The bodies were always found outside, dumped in alleys, left to rot near downtown Los Angeles, and every single time the weapon was the same, a .25 caliber handgun. Story for your living. Where that was the question Katrina McGaw's friend asked in disbelief. Right before everything unraveled, Katrina had just moved into a cozy little rental home in Ferguson, Missouri. Nothing fancy, just a quiet place to call her own, the kind of place you imagine warming up with candles, decorating with soft throws, maybe even putting a little TV in the basement for movie nights. But that basement held horrors no one should ever walk above, let alone live above, because what Katrina didn't know, what no one told her when she signed that lease, was that her new home was once a torture chamber, not a metaphor, a literal cold-blooded camera dungeon where a monster named Maury Travis brought women to die, and the person who handed her the keys was the killer's own mother. When she showed us the house, she was like, "You guys can have this table if you want." Yeah, same chairs, same table, everything. This whole basement was basically his torture chamber, and it's not okay. It wasn't until a friend called her up urging her to watch a documentary on serial killers that the dark truth clawed its way to the surface. Katrina stared in horror at her screen, at her house, the same walls, the same stairs, the same basement, except on TV that basement was drenched in shadows and the screams of forgotten victims. My Travis may have taken his secrets to the grave when he hanged himself in jail back in 2002, but the echoes of what he did inside that house, they never left. You ain't raised some _ you on there in your back smoking crack. You ain't going home tomorrow. I'm going to keep you about a week. If hell had a door, man, it might have looked a lot like Maury Travis to the outside world. He was just a hotel waiter, soft-spoken, invisible, even the kind of man who could bring you a towel, top off your water glass, and vanish into the background without a trace. But behind that forgettable face was a twisted mind, one that fed on pain, control, and the slow, calculated destruction of human life. My Troy Travis was born on October 25, 1965, and by the time he died behind bars in 2002, he had left a trail of horror that still haunts Missouri to this day. Officially, he was named in a federal criminal complaint for just 2 murders. But don't let that number fool you. In an eerie fashion, Travis would claim more victims. Some investigators were skeptical, others feared the real count might be closer to 20. 20 lives, 20 women who were kidnapped, tortured, and discarded like trash, many of them right in the basement of his home. At the time of the killings, Travis was already a convicted felon out on parole for a 1989 robbery, but no one, not parole officers, not neighbors, not even family, had any idea that a full-blown serial killer was walking free, smiling, serving drinks, plotting his next victim. When the walls finally closed in, Travis didn't face justice. He avoided trial headlines and the haunted stares of the victims' families, and then Travis decided to take the full truth of his life to the grave. But what we do know is enough to freeze your blood. Let's get into the details of everything that this monster put his victims through, but before he was a monster he was just a boy. Troy Travis was born in St. Louis, Missouri. He grew up in the city's public school system, described by neighbors as a quiet, respectful kid. Nothing about him screamed danger. He wasn't the creepy kid down the block. He didn't mutilate animals or set fires. If anything, he blended in too well. After high school, Travis even served in the Army Reserves, working as a medical and dental assistant, a job meant to heal, but somewhere along the way, perhaps when he slipped into a cocaine addiction during college, something inside him fractured. By 1989 that quiet boy was gone, replaced by a convicted felon. Travis was arrested for armed robbery and served several years in prison. When he got out, he was placed on parole and started working as a hotel waiter. Polite, predictable, still invisible, but behind closed doors he was building something, a room, a basement dungeon in his Ferguson home, rigged for control, pain and death. Between the years 2000 and 2002, Maury Travis hunted vulnerable women. He lured them in, promising company or cash. What they got was a one-way trip to hell. That basement became his stage. Travis tortured his victims for hours, sometimes days, recording their suffering on videotapes. It was a theater of cruelty, and he was the director. That's why some in law enforcement would later call him the videotape killer. The official death toll is hard to say. He was charged in connection with 2 murders, but something else would show how. He claimed 17 victims. Investigators fear the number could be even higher. Didn't stop at killing. He taunted the police, sent anonymous messages, and then he committed a mistake that will give the police a path to follow. His digital footprint, a mistake so grave that Travis will finally have to give in. But even after he was caught, his arrogance would continue to haunt the ones who followed the case. And when investigators raided the house, they found it all. The torture chamber, proof that his crimes weren't just real, they were worse than anyone imagined. You know those moments where you wish you could unsee something? That's exactly how detectives felt when they pressed play on what looked like a harmless VHS tape sitting in Maury Travis's living room. The label read, "Your wedding day." Sounds cute, right? Except it wasn't a wedding video, it was pure evil on tape inside Travis's basement. Investigators found a series of homemade recordings, real-life snuff films showing women tied up, tortured, and slowly broken down in ways that can't be erased from memory. One of the tapes showed a woman bound, blindfolded, with duct tape, struggling to breathe as Travis strangled her with a belt. His voice calm, methodical, even taunting. He didn't hide his face. He looked right into the camera like he was proud of his work. This wasn't rage, this wasn't impulsive, this was rehearsed. In some parts he made the women say their names, like he wanted to own their identities before taking their lives. He stripped them of everything, freedom, dignity, even their voices. One of the most haunting parts, the cops watching these tapes, seasoned investigators who had seen their fair share of horrors, couldn't handle it. Some needed counseling afterward. That's how disturbing the footage was, and this was only one tape, one of many. 2 names though made it past the fog of Travis's web. 2 women out of what could have been dozens were officially tied to him. Their stories are known not through their voices but through where their broken bodies were found. Alicia Green Wade had last been seen alive in Missouri. No one knew what had happened to her until April 1, 2001, when her body was discovered across state lines in Illinois. She hadn't just disappeared, she had been taken, likely lured by a man who pretended to be just another face on the street. By the time she was found, her voice had been silenced. She was part of Travis's twisted timeline, one of the women who ended up in his basement before being discarded like garbage in another state. And then came Betty James. Like Alicia, she vanished without warning. But this time the locations flipped. Betty had been last seen in Illinois. Her body turned up weeks later back in Missouri. Another woman who crossed into Maury Travis's path and never made it back. Another soul claimed by the man who stalked both sides of the state line like it was his hunting ground. These weren't just names in a case file, they were women with histories, families, aspirations, dreams, and their lives ended in the darkest way imaginable at the hands of a man who not only murdered them but also filmed it in the most dishonorable manner. And he wasn't done. Not until he slipped up. Travis's rampage didn't erupt overnight. It was a slow, methodical descent into chaos, one that began in the late 90s. He didn't just pick his victims at random. No, there was a specific group he preyed upon. Travis's targets were often vulnerable women, those whose society had cast aside. But his victims weren't just unfortunate souls, they were chosen, each one carefully selected for the precise reason that they might be overlooked, that they might not be missed when they disappeared. Women on the fringes, women whose lives were weighed down by circumstances that made them invisible to most, and Travis saw that as an opportunity, a way to feed his sick desires without fear of reprisal. Once in his vehicle, there was no turning back. The women were trapped, but it wasn't just the car that sealed their fate, it was the journey. As he drove, they were unaware of what lay ahead, remote locations far from the eyes of the public, far from any hope of escape. Once the vehicle came to a stop, Travis's true intentions became clear. His victims were forced into situations they could not escape. Often he would take them to abandoned buildings or secluded wooded areas, places where no one would hear their screams. Here he unleashed his true monstrosity. The torture was agonizing. For hours the women were subjected to unspeakable pain. Travis would sexually assault them, using his power to break them both physically and mentally. It wasn't about just ending their lives, it was about tormenting them, about forcing them to understand their helplessness, their isolation. This was not a man who killed in anger, this was a man who thrived on the slow disintegration of his victims. Well then, when the terror was too much for his victims to bear, Travis would strangle them slowly, deliberately. Each life was snuffed out, not in a burst of rage but with chilling precision. Life drained from their bodies as they gasped for air, their final moments consumed with suffocating terror. But Travis didn't just leave the bodies behind, abandoned in a moment of hasty rage. He disposed of them with meticulous care. He dumped the bodies in places that seemed forgotten, as though the world had abandoned these women long before he had even touched them. Abandoned buildings, forgotten woods, and the shadowy corners of St. Louis, places that would hide his crimes for as long as possible. What made his killing so hard to trace wasn't just the seclusion of the crime scenes, it was the very nature of his victims, women who were often viewed as disposable, women who wouldn't be immediately missed. His crimes, though horrific, blended into the background noise of a city full of desperation, and so the bodies would be found one by one without the media frenzy or public outcry that they should have provoked. Travis wasn't just a predator, he was a master manipulator. Someone who knew how to prey on the most vulnerable and remain hidden in plain sight. Each of his victims was a piece in his macaco puzzle, a puzzle that would ultimately be pieced together only after years of extreme suffering. Imagine the scene of a city gripped in fear, women disappearing without a trace, their final moments made horrendous by a monster hiding in plain sight. The clock was ticking, and with every passing day the trail grew colder, the victim count higher. But law enforcement wasn't ready to give up just yet. They weren't about to let Travis slip away. A web of techniques and strategies would slowly begin to form, a strategy to track down a killer who had evaded capture for far too long. It wasn't long before the authorities knew they needed to dig deeper. Surveillance became the first line of defense. Officers stationed themselves in the areas where the women had vanished, quietly watching, waiting for a break in the case. They kept their eyes on the streets, looking for any connection, any sign that would tie Travis to the crimes. It was a game of patience, waiting for him to make a mistake. The unknown male DNA that was found with the two victims became part of our databasing system here in the United States, which is called Cody's. But the breakthrough didn't come from watching his every move, it came from the smallest of details. Crime scenes were carefully combed for forensic evidence. DNA, fingerprints, hair and fibers were all painstakingly collected. This wasn't a job for amateurs. Investigators meticulously matched every strand of evidence to the profile of the killer they were constructing in their minds, and little by little it became clear Travis was a methodical predator. The more they examined, the more they saw patterns in his behavior, patterns that would later lead them straight to his door. The authorities knew that Travis had a pattern, they could feel it in their gut. He wasn't just wandering aimlessly, no, there was a system to his madness, and they were going to use that to their advantage. And then they used geographic profiling, a technique that would unlock the next piece of the puzzle. By studying the locations of the bodies and the places where the victims had last been seen, experts began to form a chilling picture. They mapped out every crime scene, every dumping ground, every dead end where the killer had left his mark. Slowly it became evident that Travis wasn't choosing his victims by chance, he was striking in specific calculated locations, patterns emerging. Like ghostly footprints, this wasn't just about catching a killer, it was about predicting his next move if they could identify the areas where he felt comfortable, where he operated, they might be able to stop him before another woman disappeared into his grasp. The scale of the investigation expanded rapidly. It wasn't enough for just one department to handle this case anymore. The killing spanned multiple jurisdictions, and the monster they were hunting wasn't bound by city limits. The authorities formed a task force, one united team with a singular goal: find my Travis. Dozens of detectives, analysts and investigators came together from different law enforcement agencies, pooling their resources, their knowledge and their skills. No stone would be left unturned. Every lead, no matter how small, was investigated. Every connection, no matter how small, was pursued. They were chasing a shadow, a man who had carefully concealed his identity for so long, but there was one risk that the team hadn't anticipated. Many of Travis's potential victims were still out there, living in the very areas he preyed upon. Women who had escaped his grip, who knew what he was capable of but were too terrified to come forward. They were afraid of being his next victim, so law enforcement couldn't rely on the victims to bring Travis to justice. They had to step in and protect those most at risk. Undercover officers infiltrated the high-risk areas where sex workers and drug-addicted women were most vulnerable. They posed as clients, striking up conversations, gathering information and warning the women about the danger lurking in the shadows. The officers didn't just take notes, they put their lives on the line. They were walking in the very footsteps of the killer, absorbing every detail that could lead them to Travis. It was a high-stakes game. One wrong move, one missed detail, and another life could be lost. As the task force worked tirelessly, time was their worst enemy. They knew they were getting closer. Every piece of evidence pointed them in the right direction, but with each passing day, Travis was getting bolder. He wasn't just hiding behind the shadows anymore, he was mocking the system, but it was also the break. Law enforcement had been waiting for the map he sent, as we discussed earlier. Traceable to his computer was the key. It wasn't just an arrogant brag, it was the mistake that would seal his fate. They knew they were closing in, and the net was tightening. Let's get into the details of how this investigation turned successful just because of a single mistake. From May to October of 2001, the terror spread like a poison. For more women were dragged into my Travis nightmare, tortured and strangled. Teresa Wilson, Verona Thompson, Yvonne Cruz and Brenda Beasley. These women didn't just vanish, they became part of a dark pattern that stretched across the months. Their final moments carefully planned by a man whose depravity seemed endless. It wasn't until Teresa Wilson's story hit the front page of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch that things began to crack open. This famous newspaper ran a profile piece on her disappearance, and my Travis, sitting behind the shadows, sent an anonymous letter in response. It wasn't just a series of words, it was a taunt, a challenge. He sent the paper a computer-generated map with the return address. I trolled him. It sounded like a clue, but in reality it was just another layer of manipulation. The name, a reference to a bondage website, gave nothing away except more darkness, but there was something more, something that would crack the case wide open. The map, a simple mistake, one that would ultimately seal Travis' fate. They traced the map's origins back to him. My Travis had slipped up just enough to lead them straight to his door. In his letter, Travis bragged about his reign of terror. I'll tell you where many others are, he wrote cryptically. Then he added, to prove I'm real, here's directions to number 17. Number 17, the claim that would change everything. It was the beginning of the end. When investigators raided Travis' home, they found a nightmare laid bare, a torture chamber in his basement, fully equipped with restraints, stun guns and tools meant for nothing but suffering. They found newspaper clippings about his crimes like trophies of terror, and they found the tapes, the ones where Travis himself could be seen taunting and torturing his victims. By the time the dust settled, my Travis had been linked to 12 confirmed murders, including the deaths of Mary Shields and Cassandra Walker, 2 women who were killed in the span of a year. But the real horror was in the numbers. 4 other unidentified women were found dead in the next year, adding more blood to his already tainted hands. And then Travis was arrested on June 7, but 3 days later, before he could face a courtroom or the families of the women He destroyed, he cheated justice, he hanged himself in his jail cell on June 10. In his suicide note he apologized to his mother and confessed to being mentally ill since age 14. The bodies, the tapes, the pain, it all stayed behind, and just over a decade later a woman named Katrina McGaw unknowingly rented that same house. She found out the truth while watching a documentary on serial killers. Her blood ran cold. That cozy rental, that was the house where women had screamed, begged and died. The house was owned by Sandra Travis Morey's mother. She broke her lease and never looked back. Travis's death marked the end of the trial that would have exposed his crimes to the world, but even in his final moments he left behind the echo of his terror, a terror that would haunt the victims' families, the investigators, and anyone who came into contact with the darkness he had created. Just when it seemed like justice was within reach, my Travis cheated fate. Even after being placed on suicide watch, he was checked every 15 minutes, but in a weird twist of fate 2 consecutive checks were missed by guards. That small window of time was all he needed. Story 5. He seemed invisible, boring, forgettable, but behind that dead-eyed stare was a monster who couldn't stop killing even when the bodies started stacking up. I didn't really think I had an urge to kill her, I just wanted her to stop. What did you want to do to her? What did I want to do to her? Just to have her stop. Gary Ridgway wasn't flashy, he wasn't a genius, he didn't have a signature catchphrase or a flashy MMO. He was just ordinary, a guy who stuttered often while speaking, who clocked into his job at a truck factory, mowed his lawn on weekends, and blended in so well with suburban life that even when he was a prime suspect in a string of grisly murders, the cops couldn't quite make it stick. But don't let the bland exterior fool you. This man murdered 49 confirmed, but he claims the number could be closer to 70, maybe even higher. His victims were young women, often sex workers, often runaways, always vulnerable. Gary strangled them with his bare hands or with crude ligatures like shoelaces, ropes, whatever was around, and he'd dump their bodies near Washington's Green River or in the thick woods nearby. And sometimes he'd come back, not to bury them, not to move them, but to violate them again long after they were dead. It was the early 1980s, and in King County, Washington, bodies were turning up fast. A woman here, another one there, 5 in total, all found in or near the Green River. The media needed a name and they got one: the Green River Killer, a faceless predator who hunted at night and vanished into the fog by morning. But here's the kicker: the killer was already known to police. Gary Ridgway had been questioned back in 1982. He even passed a lie detector test. The man responsible for one of the biggest murder sprees in U.S. history was right under their noses, and they let him walk free at home. Ridgway played the part of a devoted family man. He was married multiple times, he was deeply religious, even tried to preach door-to-door, but all the while he was searching the red light districts of Seattle looking for his next victim. How? Tell me, explain that process to me. One of them was as you as I. They would, a woman would get in the car, she's already in the car, let's say she's already in the car driving down the road, and she wants to see my ID, so I whipped out my ID, and my ID would be I'd put my finger over my driver's license to hide my name, but on the opposite side was pictures and a picture of my son, and they would come to see my son and they would know I was a probably normal person, but you were really using your son as part of your ruse, because only at the time I didn't want a picture of my ex-wife there, so I had a picture of my son. Sure, you had to make it sound good. I had a driver's license on one side of my ID, and then when I showed and then the next picture was of my son, so there was and in the vehicle I had some, always had some, not always, but had some of my son's stuff in there, and the scariest part is that he'd often bring his young son along for the ride as a human shield. See, I have a kid with me, I'm not a threat. That's the kind of calculated manipulation Ridgway was capable of, cold, heartless, methodical. Where did this monster come from, you may wonder? Gary Ridgway didn't crawl out of the shadows. He was born in broad daylight in Salt Lake City, Utah on February 18, 1949, the middle child of 3 boys. Ridgway grew up in a house that looked normal from the outside, but inside it was a wreck. His mother, Mary, was a force of nature, controlling, intense and terrifying. She ruled the house with a tight grip and wasn't afraid to use a belt or stick when her sons went out of lines drawn by her. His father, a bus driver, wasn't any good often venting about the filth of sex workers he'd see on his routes. That constant commentary would embed itself into Gary's twisted worldview and fester into a hatred that will lead him to become a nightmare. Gary would later tell psychologists that he felt both anger and sexual attraction toward his mother, the same woman who disciplined him with belts and dominated the house was the subject of his violent fantasies. He even imagined killing her. So far it sounds like a textbook serial killer origin story. Wait till it gets worse. By high school, Ridgway was already falling behind. He had dyslexia, struggled in class and got held back a year. His IQ would fluctuate in the low 80s, but what he lacked in smarts he made up for in something far more sinister. At just 16 years old, he did the unthinkable. He lured a 6-year-old boy into the woods and stabbed him in the ribs, piercing his liver. The boy survived, but Gary Ridgway had made his first real move toward becoming a killer, and no one seemed to notice. No follow-up, no serious consequences, just another angry kid from a rough home. But inside that teenager something was growing, a rage, a hunger, a compulsion that would eventually take hold and leave dozens of women dead in his wake. Gary Ridgway graduated from Thai High School in 1969 and did what a lot of young men did back then. In 1969, he married his teenage girlfriend Claudia Craig and enlisted in the Navy. From the outside it looked like he had found his calling, but Gary never stayed on the path for long. He was shipped off to Vietnam, where he served on a supply ship and saw combat. But it wasn't the bullets that left a mark, it was the brothel. While overseas, Ridgway racked up frequent flyer miles with local sex workers. He even caught gonorrhea, which infuriated him, but not enough to make him stop. That compulsion was already starting to take hold, and just like that his first marriage crumbled. Done within a year. Back in the States, Ridgway gave the word double life a whole new meaning. By the time he married his second wife, Marcia Winslow, he'd become intensely religious. He'd read scriptures out loud at home, cry after sermons, and preach door to door like he was on a mission to save souls. But while he was reciting Bible verses by day, he was cruising the streets at night looking for sex workers. His appetite was insatiable. His ex-wives and girlfriends said he demanded sex multiple times a day, often in public places or even in the same wooded areas where years later his victims' bodies would be found. To the outside world, Ridgway was weird but harmless, a bit too intense with religion, maybe a little off, but nothing scary. Behind closed doors, though, Gary was unraveling. He had a sick obsession with prostitutes, and not just lust, it was hatred too, a burning resentment. He admitted in court that he didn't want to pay them and felt justified in ending their lives. Some believe he was at war with himself, his raw animalistic urges clashing against his desperate need to feel righteous. That tension between the preacher and the predator would fuel one of the most horrifying murder sprees in American history. While all of this was happening, he had a son with Marcia, a child growing up with a serial killer dad who had no idea what was going on behind the scenes. Gary Ridgway began acting upon his hatred in the summer of 1982. It was then that the lifeless body of his first known victim surfaced along the banks of the Green River. Wrapped around her neck was a piece of clothing tainted with an industrial spray paint, one that wouldn't be analyzed for another 2 decades. At the time it was just another overlooked detail, but had it been tested, that microscopic trail could have pulled Ridgway into the spotlight much earlier. Instead, he slipped back into the shadows and kept killing. Over the next 2 years, death spread like a plague across King County, Washington, and the Green River became more than just a picnic spot. It became a graveyard. Body after body surfaced along its muddy edges and in dense mossy woods near Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The victims had one haunting thing in common: they were all young women, many of them sex workers or runaways, the forgotten and discarded of society. They were easy prey, and Gary Ridgway knew it. He stalked Pacific Highway South in his pickup truck, armed with nothing but a disarming smile, a wallet full of cash, and sometimes a photo of his son. That image, so ordinary, so innocently paternal, drove his victims into a false sense of security. It was part of his carefully crafted trap. Ridgway would coax the women into his truck, drive to secluded areas, and then, after briefly getting intimate, he would strike with terrifying precision, one arm locked across their necks like a vice, the other pulling tight with practiced force. There was no hesitation, no remorse. He squeezed the Life out of them slowly, methodically, until their limp bodies sagged in the seat beside him. Often he'd kill them in his home or truck, other times in the middle of the forest where no one could hear their last gasps. Then he'd dump the corpses in clusters without clothes and twisted among ferns and dirt, sometimes posed in grotesque, degrading ways, their eyes staring up blankly toward the trees. But his brutality didn't end with death. Ridgway revisited his victims' corpses. Sometimes days later he'd return to their graves like a predator guarding its kill, crawling through branches to lie beside their rotting bodies, violating them again. It wasn't about lust, he later confessed, it was about control. Raping dead bodies meant no resistance, no rejection, no cost. He didn't have to pay them and didn't have to worry about being turned in. The silence of the dead was the only intimacy he craved. He went so far as to contaminate his dump sites, leaving behind cigarette butts and chewed gum from other people, scattering belongings that weren't his, all in an effort to confuse investigators. In some cases he even transported victims across state lines, dumping bodies in Oregon to muddy the trail. It worked. The body count rose, and the killer stayed hidden behind his mask of normalcy. By 1983 the panic had become undeniable, with 5 women dead and more missing. The Green River Task Force was formed, spearheaded by seasoned officers like Robert Keel and Dave Riker. The group was under immense pressure. They were chasing a ghost who left almost no forensic evidence and blended in with blue-collar regulars desperate for insight. The task force even turned to Ted Bundy, who from his prison cell in Florida offered his own theory. The killer was returning to the bodies for sex. Bundy warned them to stake out fresh dump sites. He wasn't just speculating, he was describing Ridgway's behavior with eerie accuracy. Still, Ridgway all eluded capture. He was arrested once in 1982 and again in 2001 for prostitution-related charges, but released both times in 1983. 18-year-old Marie Malver disappeared. Her boyfriend and pimp had trailed the truck she entered, a maroon pickup, to a house. That house belonged to Gary Ridgway. The police interviewed him, noted his calm demeanor, and let him go. Other tips named him too, but nothing stuck. A year later he passed a polygraph test. The man killing women by the dozens was clever enough to beat the machine. What the task force didn't know was that Ridgway was also juggling a personal life that shielded him from suspicion. By 1985 he had met Judith Mosen, a kind, unsuspecting woman who became his third wife. She moved into his modest house in Seattle, Tacoma, where unknown to her countless women had died just feet from the bed she slept in. There was no carpet when she moved in. Detectives later told her that's because he'd likely used it to wrap up corpses, but Judith had noticed nothing. Ridgway played the role of a loving, quiet husband. He brought her flowers, mowed the lawn, and held a steady job at the Kenworth truck factory. When he disappeared early in the morning for overtime shifts, Judith never questioned it. Those hours were when he hunted. Curiously, Ridgway's murder spree slowed significantly after marrying Judith. He later told investigators that she made him feel content, that he truly loved her, and perhaps that fragile connection was enough to curb the storm inside him. Of his 49 confirmed murders, only 3 occurred after their wedding in 1988. Judith herself once said, "But love wasn't enough to bury his past." In 1987 investigators collected saliva and hair samples from Ridgway, storing them in evidence lockers for years. It wasn't until the rise of DNA profiling in the early 2000s that science finally caught up to him. A year later, in November, while he was at work painting trucks at Kenworth, police walked in and arrested him. 2 decades of horror came to a halt. On that factory floor, DNA linked Ridgway to the murders of Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, Cynthia Hines, and Carol Ann Christensen, all of whom had been discarded like trash across King County. Later, 3 more names were added to the indictment: Wendy Caulfield, Deborah Bonner, and Deborah Estes. The link wasn't just semen, it was microscopic spray paint spheres matched exactly to the formula used at Kenworth during Ridgway's tenure. That same paint had clung to clothing wrapped around his first victim's throat. The monster had always been right there, driving among them, smiling at co-workers, quoting Bible verses, killing again and again, and still being lucky enough to head home for dinner. By the summer of 2003, whispers began swirling through Seattle's media: Gary Ridgway, the man Behind the worst serial killing spree in American history might escape the death penalty, the idea sent shockwaves through the public. How could the Green River Killer, a man who had confessed to choking the life out of dozens of women and desecrating their corpses, be allowed to live? The answer is a deal with the devil. Ridgway had spent over 2 decades outsmarting law enforcement, blending into society and leaving a trail of bodies stretching from Washington to Oregon, but now with the hard evidence finally catching up to him, DNA, paint particles and recovered remains, he was cornered. His lawyers, led by Anthony Savage, began to negotiate the unthinkable. Ridgway would be spared execution only if he confessed fully to the murders and helped locate the victims still lying in the woods, forgotten. In November 2003 the plea was finalized. The Green River Killer stood in court and admitted to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder, but this wasn't a display of remorse, it was a calculated confession delivered in exchange for life. In his signed statement, Ridgway explained how he had committed every murder inside King County, Washington, and transported a few victims to Oregon specifically to throw investigators off his trail. It was a long game of cat and mouse, a game he had nearly won. Deputy Prosecutor Jeffrey Baird acknowledged the scale of the deal. 41 of the 48 victims would never have been connected to Ridgway in court if not for the plea. The case against him had evidence for only 7 murders. Without his cooperation, the rest would have remained nameless, numbers buried in case files. On December 18, 2003, Ridgway returned to the courtroom not as a suspect but as a self-admitted mass murderer. There would be no trial, no debate, just the cold hammer of justice. Mr. Ridgway, how do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 1 for the death of Wendy Lee Caulfield? Guilty. How do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 2? Guilty. Judge Richard A. Jones handed down the sentence, 48 life sentences without the possibility of parole to be served consecutively for 180 additional years, 10 for each victim for tampering with evidence, while Gary received rightful curses from the victim's family. One statement from a victim's father would break his emotionless facade. I'm not one of them. You've made it difficult to live up to what I believe, and that is what God says to do, and that's to forgive. In the months that followed, Ridgway led police to 3 more bodies. On August 16, 2003, a hiker found the remains of 16-year-old Pammy Annette Avant dumped off State Route 410. Then in September, the bodies of Marie Malver, the woman whose boyfriend had once led police to Ridgway's door, and April Buttram were unearthed in shallow woodland graves 2 years later. On November 20, a weekend hiker in Issaquah stumbled upon a human skull. DNA would confirm it belonged to Tracy Winston, a 19-year-old who vanished from Northgate Mall in 1983. It was the 49th confirmed victim, and it earned Ridgway one more life sentence. And even decades later, Ridgway's trail of destruction kept unraveling. In 2023, forensic science finally gave a name to a victim long known only as Bone 17. She was 15-year-old Lori Ann Raspotnik, last seen alive in 1982. Her remains had waited nearly 40 years to be identified. Over the course of 5 months, Ridgway sat across from investigators, dead-eyed and disturbingly calm, unspooling one confession after another. In some interviews he claimed 65 victims, in others 71, and he often couldn't remember names, only places, vague appearances, or where he had left their bodies. On February 9, 2004, prosecutors began releasing the videotaped confessions. What the world saw was not a remorseful man but a cold, matter-of-fact killer, talking about strangling women like it was part of his morning routine. He admitted to necrophilia without a flicker of shame. He explained that he buried later victims to stop himself from revisiting them because he feared he might not be able to resist. He confessed to picking prostitutes because they were easy to pick up and because he hated most of them. To Ridgway, they were disposable. Their lives meant nothing beyond his brief violent thrill. With 49 confirmed victims, Ridgway confessed to more confirmed murders than any other serial killer in American history, but investigators and Ridgway himself believe the real number is much higher. Dozens more women may remain missing, their bodies still hidden in forests, ravines and rivers across the Pacific Northwest. He now lives out his days in Walla Walla State Penitentiary, where he will never again walk free. The Green River Killer is no longer stalking highways, he's locked behind bars, but the scars he left, the empty chairs at dinner tables, the daughters who never came home, the mothers who died not knowing what happened to their children, those remain. When Gary Ridgway entered the Washington State Penitentiary in January 2004, the man who once roamed highways and back roads as a predator was now just another inmate stripped of power, cloaked in a jumpsuit and watched around the clock. But Ridgway was no ordinary prisoner. He was placed in solitary confinement, isolated from other inmates. Not for his safety but for theirs. Even among rapists and murderers his name carried a weight of revulsion. His crimes were too depraved, too numerous, too cold-blooded. For over a decade he rotted behind those stone walls in Walla Walla, but then in May 2015 he disappeared from Washington, quietly flown across state lines and deposited inside USP Florence High, a high-security federal prison in Colorado. The move went mostly unnoticed. Once word spread, the public backlash was quick and furious. Why was the most prolific serial killer in American history being housed out of state, hundreds of miles from the crimes he committed and the families who still demanded justice? Governor Jay Inslee stepped in, so did Corrections Secretary Bernie Warner, and soon the message was clear: Ridgway was too important to move off the map. He still held secrets, answers to open murder investigations, clues buried deep in his decaying memory. On October 24, 2015, Ridgway was flown back to Washington State Penitentiary, chained, watched and escorted by a chartered plane. Like some twisted form of royalty, he's remained there ever since. But even now the story isn't finished. In September 2024, Ridgway was quietly pulled from his cell and transferred back to King County Jail, the place where all of this began. The move was unannounced, unexplained, and shrouded in mystery. For days he vanished from the penitentiary's records, raising questions among journalists and victims' families. Why now? Why him? What did he still know? The silence only deepened until March 2025, when the sealed transfer order was finally made public. The reason: Ridgway was still leading investigators to bodies, more women, more forgotten graves. Even after 2 decades behind bars, the Green River Killers still had secrets to spill, and we may never know all of their names. Many were runaways, prostitutes, or young girls caught in the cracks of society, women whose disappearances barely made headlines, whose families were told they were probably just out there somewhere. But Ridgway knew better. He hunted them because they were easy to forget. In some confessions he struggled to remember their faces. He gave investigators vague details: the girl I left by the fence, the one with curly hair, the one I went back to. His victims became ghosts, defined only by where they were discarded. Even now, with decades of police work behind it, the Green River case feels unfinished. Some remains were found by hikers, others were uncovered by dogs, a few were discovered only because Ridgway agreed to speak, and some may never be found, buried so deep in the woods they returned to the earth completely. To this day, the FBI and Washington State investigators believe there are still bodies out there waiting for someone to remember them, waiting for their names. And that's the final horrific legacy of Gary Ridgway: not just the number of women he killed, but the silence he left behind. The names we'll never know, the stories that will never be told. Story 6: Jason Galehouse and Michael Watchhalls both went missing in the year 2003, both from Tampa, Florida, both from the heart of the city's vibrant LGBTQ+ community. I can just recall his face. He didn't look the same. There's nothing behind his eyes. It was dark. His face was contorted, which further panicked me. But what happened next was far worse than anyone could imagine. These weren't just disappearances, they were brutal, unspeakable murders that shocked and terrorized the entire LGBTQ+ community. I don't even have a grave, a body, or a tombstone. I have the city dumped with my son, ground up like hamburger meat in the dirt. The man behind these twisted acts would become a living nightmare. His name forever linked to horror. For me it will be justice to find out what happened about those other men. I want that man to get the death penalty and nothing less. So who is this monster, and how did he evade justice for so long? Stay with us as we dive into the dark truth behind these gruesome crimes, and trust me when I say this is the kind of case that will haunt you for days making you question how anyone could be so cruel, so heartless, to take lives in such a twisted and unimaginable way. To even understand how things went so wrong, we need to start by getting to know Scott, another man at the center of this case. It was October 2003 when Scott made the bold decision to leave Chicago behind and start a new chapter in Orlando, Florida. At that time he had just turned 38 and was in the middle of completing a course to become a personal trainer. On the outside it looked like Scott was simply focused on his career and a fresh start, but little did anyone know there was much more to him than met the eye. Now Scott wasn't the loud, attention-seeking type. In fact, he kept a relatively low profile, staying out of the spotlight, but there was an entirely different side of Scott that he kept hidden from those around him. You see, Scott was an active member of an online platform specifically for gay men where he went by the name Master Scott. It was on this platform that he met another user who went by the handle Dumb Dude for Sub, a Florida native who was not too far from where Scott had just moved. The fact that they were now closer physically made their interactions all the more convenient, and it wasn't long before they began talking more frequently. What initially seemed like a simple connection over shared interests soon revealed a darker and more complex side. Scott and Dumb Dude for Sub quickly discovered they both shared a fascination with BDSM, particularly the dominant submissive dynamic. They were both intrigued by the idea of power control and the psychological elements that came with such a relationship, but their discussions, which began as casual chats about fantasy, soon escalated into something far more dangerous. As they kept talking, things got creepier and more dangerous. They started talking about kidnapping men, keeping them as slaves, torturing them, and possibly selling them. In their chats they even had the perfect place to hide someone, a small hidden apartment in Seal Heights. It was quiet, out of the way, and nobody would hear a thing. They even planned to do a test run just to see how it would go, but that wasn't all. They also talked about using GHB, a drug that makes people black out and forget everything. It would leave their victims totally helpless, unable to fight back or even remember what happened to them. And their talks got even worse. They said they worked well together and could do it again. Then they started planning for the future. They talked about buying a cheap piece of land far away from the city, somewhere they could take people without anyone noticing. Dumb Dude for Sub even suggested looking east of Tampa near Interstate 4. He said it would be easy to find a place out there where screams wouldn't be heard. So by the time December 2003 rolled around, Scott decided to take the next step and meet Dumb Dude for Sub in person. He traveled to Tampa, excited to take their online connection into the real world, and in person the man was Steven Lorenzo, who was a bit older than Scott and had more experience in the world. They both shared Steven, born on May 27, 1961, had an unassuming start to life, one that seemed like it could belong to anyone. He grew up in a typical American family, and from the outside everything seemed normal. His childhood was calm, with no signs of any future notoriety to those who knew him back then. Steven was just another guy in the neighborhood, quiet, reserved, and blending into the background. But if there's one thing we know, it's that the quietest people sometimes harbor the darkest secrets. Eventually Steven settled in Tampa, Florida, hoping to lead a peaceful life. He ran a small cleaning company which made a decent living and kept him busy. To his clients he was the friendly guy who would show up to clean their carpets or furniture. He was polite, professional, and unassuming, with no reason to suspect anything beyond the surface. But as Scott later realized, while Scott had fantasies, Steven had the kind of real-life experiences that would pull Scott deeper into a world far darker than he ever anticipated. Because even before Scott made his way to Tampa, Steven had already been in contact with another man online, arranging a meeting where all three would engage in a dominant submissive role play. The third man, identified only as O by the police, would play the submissive, with Steven and Scott assuming the dominant roles. And when they first met, it happened in a parking lot where the three briefly exchanged words through their car windows for about 5 minutes before heading back to Steven's house. There was no indication of drugging or anything illicit. War was fully willing to participate. Once they arrived at Steven's home, War was restrained to a bed with leather restraints, and the session began. The encounter continued for some time, but towards the end, War began to feel uncomfortable and requested they stop later or would tell the police that he had been assaulted. Claiming a rod had been inserted into his body and that he was violated while Stephen tried to comfort him with calming techniques. However, according to Scott, O did not mention any assault during the session. In fact, both Scott and Stephen parted ways with no sense that any boundaries had been crossed the morning after Scott left and returned to Orlando. Then on the afternoon of Friday, December 19, 2003, Scott made his way back to Tampa. He met Stephen once again and the two spent some time hanging out in the city before heading out for drinks. Around 9:30 p.m. they went to a local bar for a drink, then made their way to the 260 Club, one of the premier gay clubs in Tampa at the time, where their night would take another unexpected turn. Scott and Lorenzo had initially planned to lure someone else to Lorenzo's home with the promise of work. In fact, Scott had someone in mind, but the person stopped responding to calls and emails. It was then that Lorenzo introduced Scott to someone new, someone who would soon become an integral part of the chilling events that would follow. This man was named Jason Galos. At the time, Jason was 26 years old and had recently moved to Tampa from Sarasota, hoping to build a new life. He worked as a florist and had plans to pursue a career in interior design, taking college classes to prepare. Jason was described by those who knew him as an outgoing, charismatic young man. He stayed in touch with his family, especially his mother, and was known for his upbeat personality. Little did Jason know that this night would be the beginning of his tragic end. As mentioned earlier, Lorenzo introduced Jason to Scott with the intention of bringing him into their world, which they had both been exploring online. BDM. Jason, however, didn't know the full extent of what he was walking into. They didn't waste any time, and soon Jason, Scott, and Lorenzo found themselves at Lorenzo's house, a seemingly ordinary setting that would quickly turn into the scene of a nightmare. As they all settled in, Lorenzo excused himself to go to the bathroom. While he was away, Jason and Scott shared some intimate moments in the living room. It seemed innocent enough at first, but that would all change when Lorenzo returned. Now, according to Scott, he stepped away to use the bathroom for a while, but when he came back, Lorenzo had Jason in a chokehold. By this time, Jason was struggling, his legs kicking in panic, desperately trying to break free from Lorenzo's grip. Lorenzo, calm and methodical, asked Scott to help him hold Jason down. Scott, in a state of shock, followed Lorenzo's instructions. Together they restrained Jason, and after what felt like an eternity, the kicking stopped and Jason was now dead. But according to Lorenzo, this is how it went. But no matter what the truth was about that night, it didn't change the fact that they dismembered Jason's body using power tools, specifically a sawzall, an industrial-grade power saw. The two men set to work. The harsh grinding sound of the saw cutting through flesh and bone echoed through the garage, a chilling soundtrack to the brutality of what they were doing. They severed Jason's limbs, removed his head, and methodically cut his body into pieces small enough to be hidden. Every part of him was mutilated, each piece taken apart with horrifying precision. After they were done with Jason Galehouse, they didn't panic, they didn't act like people who had just done something horrifying. Instead, they calmly put his body parts into 6 separate trash bags, each one holding a piece of him, but these weren't carefully hidden or buried. No, they scattered them across Tampa like it was nothing, just tossing them into random dumpsters as if Jason had never mattered. And the scariest part, before they even began cutting up the body, they went out for an early breakfast like it was just another normal day. And when they finally returned home, Lorenzo casually took a nap while Scott stayed up drinking beer, haunted and sleepless. But for Lorenzo, one night of horror wasn't enough. He wanted to do it again, and the very next evening he and Scott were back at the 2606 Club. That's where they met Michael Watchhalls, a 27-year-old waiter who had recently moved to Tampa from Tarpon Springs. Michael was friendly but private. He just started reconnecting with his mom and was trying to rebuild his life. Unfortunately, he had no idea what he was walking into when he agreed to party with the two men at Lorenzo's house. The setup began again. Scott distracted Michael in the kitchen while Lorenzo mixed GHB into his drink, but things didn't go as smoothly this time. Michael didn't pass out right away. Instead, Moments later Scott heard Lorenzo yelling from the living room. He rushed in and found Michael struggling underneath Lorenzo, shouting, "This is not consensual." Michael was fighting with everything he had, but he didn't stand a chance. Scott helped hold him down, and then Lorenzo pulled out a chemical spray called maximum impact ethyl chloride. It's a toxic inhalant that knocks people out fast. Lorenzo soaked a handkerchief with it and pressed it to Michael's face until he went limp. With Michael unconscious, they stripped him, tied him up and taped his mouth shut so he couldn't scream. But during the attack something went wrong. Michael's body began to shake uncontrollably, then stopped moving. The drugs had taken a deadly toll this time, though Scott refused to help with another dismemberment. Maybe guilt was catching up to him, maybe the shock was too much. Either way, they decided to do things differently. They wrapped Michael's body in a bed sheet, gathered his belongings and stuffed everything into trash bags. Then they loaded it all into Michael's Jeep. Wearing gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints, they drove the Jeep to an apartment complex, parked it and walked away into the night like nothing had happened. No panic, no regrets. Lorenzo in fact seemed proud. That's when it hit Scott. Lorenzo had done this before in a later timeline. This was how the prosecutor opened her statements, emphasizing just how calculated Stephen and Scott were in their crimes. To us in the least, easier to find a loner guy, less connection. I do a chokehold from behind, you hold him down, strap him up, not to be found again. He wasn't going to be going back. These are quotes from America Online. Instant messages between Master Scott, who we now know as Scott Schwiger, and DOM Dude or Sub, who we now know as Stephen Lorenzo. This was the moment the police knew they were up against someone truly sinister. Just in the video of Stephen smiling as he looked on during the prosecutor's statements, it was chilling. It sent a cold shiver down everyone's spine, a stark contrast to the horror of his actions. And then came the agonizing waiting. On January 6, 2004, 17 days after Michael Wachholz had been abandoned in his SUV by Stephen Lorenzo and Scott Schwiger, his body was finally discovered. It was found in a Tampa apartment complex, left to rot in the vehicle. The smell was unbearable. Officers arrived to find the scene marked by the unmistakable signs of decomposition, making it nearly impossible to pinpoint how he died. Sergeant Junior Burton, leading the homicide division of the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office, explained that the time lost in the heat of the Florida sun had stolen precious evidence. As days past, memories blurred and even the smallest details slipped away, making the investigation feel like an impossible puzzle. The medical examiner's office, after examining Michael's remains, called the cause of death undetermined due to the severe decomposition. For the investigators, this was a gut-wrenching blow. Without a clear cause of death, they had no direction to go in. Toxicology reports came back inconclusive, offering little to no insight, and as you can probably imagine, justice didn't come quickly after Jason Gale House and Michael Wachholz were reported missing. The police acted fast because, as it turns out, they weren't the only ones who went missing. Between December 2000 and the present, the Tampa Police Department has originated 4 missing persons investigations. Within Hillsborough County, Florida, Clearwater Police Department has originated 1 missing persons investigation. Within Pinellas County, Florida, and Fort Lauderdale Police Department has originated 1 missing persons investigation in 2004 and 2 missing persons investigations in 1988. Within Broward County, Florida, all of the victims have been identified as gay men who went missing from local nightclubs, and only 1 body has been recovered. Officers immediately started asking questions. They went to the victims' families, friends, even neighbors, trying to figure out where the 2 young men were last seen. Nobody expected what would come next, but everything changed on November 2, 2004, the day Stephen Lorenzo was finally arrested. But this moment didn't just happen out of nowhere. It was the result of months of non-stop investigation. The turning point came when someone, a friend of one of the missing men, stepped forward with crucial information. They told police that their friend had been last seen with Stephen Lorenzo, and they didn't just stop there. They gave detectives a full account of Lorenzo's strange behavior that night, how he talked, how he acted, and how something just didn't feel right. This gave detectives their first real lead, a piece of the puzzle that made them take an even closer look at Lorenzo as they dug deeper. A dark and terrifying pattern started to emerge. Lorenzo wasn't just connected to one or two cases, he was connected to several strange disappearances, and these weren't coincidences. He had a method he would lure young men, usually gay men, with offers of friendship, drugs, or parties. Sometimes he used money to gain their trust, but once he got them alone, everything changed. He would drug them, often using powerful sedatives, and then assault them. At first the police thought these might just be isolated cases, but the more they looked into it, the more they realized Lorenzo had been getting away with this kind of behavior for years. There were older police reports survivors had come forward in the past. Some of them had told officers how Lorenzo tried to drug them, or how they woke up after a night they couldn't remember, injured, confused, and terrified. One survivor said he was lucky to escape, and that escape probably saved his life. In fact, this was Lorenzo's victim. Back in 2000, the evidence started piling up fast, with more and more victims speaking up and new details coming to light. It was clear that Lorenzo had been hiding in plain sight. He had built a twisted world right under everyone's noses, one where young men disappeared and no one knew why. With everything finally coming together, the authorities acted on that November day. Stephen Lorenzo was placed in handcuffs. The man who had lived a double life for so long was now exposed to the world. But even though the arrest brought a sense of relief, it was just the beginning. Justice wasn't done yet. Eventually police got a search warrant for Lorenzo's home, and what they found inside was worse than anyone expected. It was like stepping into a nightmare. Behind closed doors, buried in drawers and boxes with the clues to a horrifying truth, investigators found disturbing photographs, images of his victims that were deeply personal and painful to look at. They also found items that had clearly belonged to the missing men: wallets, pieces of clothing, even personal ID cards. But it didn't stop there. There were also tools, objects used to overpower, control, and silence his victims: restraints, syringes filled with drugs, and strange equipment that no one should ever have. These weren't just random things, they were tools of torture, control, and death. When they finally brought Stephen Lorenzo into the station for questioning, everyone noticed how strangely calm he was. It was the kind of calm that didn't feel right. There was no panic, no fear in his eyes. He acted like he had nothing to hide, like he was just a man being wrongly accused. He denied everything, every single accusation thrown at him. He shrugged it off, but detectives weren't buying it because the truth, the evidence, was overwhelming. It was stacked high and deep. There were photographs, drugs, personal items that clearly belonged to the missing victims. And perhaps most powerful of all, the heartbreaking testimonies of survivors who had lived through terrifying experiences. And finally something broke. Lorenzo confessed. He admitted to several murders. He described what he did in chilling detail, but even then he didn't tell the whole truth. He wouldn't say how many people he had actually killed. He wouldn't explain exactly what happened to all of his victims. He held on to those secrets, keeping the full truth from the families who desperately needed closure. One of the biggest shocks came when investigators discovered that Lorenzo had drugged at least 9 men using a combination of GHB and other sedatives to paralyze and control them. These weren't just random acts, it was a calculated pattern. Among those 9 were Jason Galehouse and Michael Watchhalls, 2 young men whose names would forever be linked to this nightmare. Both of them were lured, drugged, and killed, and sadly they were only the confirmed cases. Authorities believe there were more, possibly many more, whose stories ended the same way but were never fully uncovered. And what about Scott Schweikert, the man who had once been Lorenzo's partner in crime? He didn't stay silent. Pressured by the mountain of evidence and haunted by what he had done, Scott confessed too. He admitted that he had helped Lorenzo commit some of the crimes. As part of a plea deal, he agreed to testify in court. His confession was brutal and painful to hear. He described how they chose their victims, how they gained their trust, how they drugged them until they couldn't fight back. Some were sexually assaulted, some were killed. Scott's testimony filled in the missing pieces of a puzzle that had tormented investigators and families for years. His words confirmed the horror. By the year 2005, the charges against Stephen Lorenzo were finally official. He was accused of some of the most horrific crimes imaginable: murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. For the families who had been waiting for justice, it was a sign of hope. After years of uncertainty, grief, and desperate searching for answers, they were about to see the man responsible face the consequences of his actions, but as they would soon discover, the road to justice wasn't going to be easy. In 2006, Lorenzo's trial began, and it didn't take long for it to capture national attention. The crimes were so shocking, so gruesome, that the public couldn't look away. Lorenzo was accused of killing Jason Galehouse and Michael Watchhalls, but everyone knew there were more victims whose names hadn't been uncovered yet. The prosecution came prepared. They had photographs, DNA evidence, and survivor testimonies that painted a picture so disturbing it felt like a nightmare. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation as everyone waited for the truth to unfold. But Stephen Lorenzo wasn't done playing his twisted games in a move that stunned everyone. He chose to represent himself in court. No lawyer, no legal team, just him. This decision wasn't about clearing his name, it was about dragging the case out, delaying justice at every turn. The trial stretched on for years. Lorenzo would argue over the smallest details, waste time with bizarre motions, and even question the relevance of things like homemade sex tapes found in his home to the families of the victims. Each delay felt like a slap in the face. The pain was still fresh, and every additional day they had to wait for closure made it harder to bear. Inside the courtroom, the families sat through every moment of the trial. They forced themselves to hear every devastating detail of what had happened to their sons, brothers, and friends. They learned how their loved ones were tricked, drugged, and ultimately taken from them forever. For many it was unbearable. Some cried quietly in the back, holding on to photos of their lost ones, trying to find a small piece of comfort amid the overwhelming sorrow. The grief was suffocating. Then, in December of 2022, nearly 20 years after the crimes were committed, something shifted. Stephen Lorenzo finally stopped fighting the truth. In a shocking twist, he pleaded guilty to the murders of Jason Galehouse and Michael Watchhalls. He admitted what he had done, no longer hiding behind lies and excuses, and in a moment that stunned everyone in the courtroom, he requested the death penalty. He said he deserved it after so many years of denying his crimes, of manipulating the system and playing games. Lorenzo finally came clean. But even in that moment of confession, he didn't give the families everything they were hoping for. He still held back. He didn't reveal the full extent of his crimes, didn't confess to every murder, and didn't say where the other victims might be. The families were left with more questions than answers, and the closure they longed for remained just out of reach. The jury in Hillsborough County found him guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder along with kidnapping and sexual assault. The weight of the verdict hit hard. There was relief. Finally, after all these years, justice had been served, but it was bittersweet. Justice was partial. The victims' families knew that there were still other victims out there, still people whose loved ones were missing, still families left in the dark. On February 25, 2023, Judge Christopher Sabella looked Lorenzo dead in the eyes and delivered the final blow. He sentenced him to death, one Italian to another. That translates to, I sentence you, Mr. Lorenzo, to death. That is the punishment that you deserve for these horrific crimes. Now, Stephen Lorenzo sits on death row in a Florida prison. His reign of terror is over. His manipulations have come to an end, and to this day Jason Galehouse's body has never been discovered. His mother, forever haunted by the unknown, has only one thing to say: the pain of never having closure is a wound that will never heal. The unanswered questions continue to weigh on her heart, the grief compounded by the mystery of where her son's remains might be now. I want to hear your thoughts on this. As the rain gently falls and the night grows deeper, thank you for joining me here at MR Night Cared True Crime Stories. Remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep, and until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.